The wolf took a deep inhale, its snout pointed to the cable lines above. It didn't know what exactly, but it could feel something changing about the devourer skill. As its feast continued, a buzzing of adrenaline, of excitement, of hunger beyond the depth of its own flesh ravaged its sense of patience, and before long, it was taking a couple minute-long rests in between feedings as soon as its jaw stopped feeling like it was about to fall off, just to devour the countless rats. It could sleep, but with every minute wasted, the flesh grew less nurturing and more unusable for anything but subpar nutrition. A factor about flesh that it had not considered before was simply its state of decomposition. Decomposing flesh was much less effective for nutrients, and it honestly wasn't entirely sure of how Devourer would be able to put rotting flesh to use. It could take the normal flesh in storage and use it for keeping itself fed for prolonged periods of time, using the water content of the blood to keep it hydrated with the rest of the bits being used as nutrition, among various other possibilities, but the instinctual knowledge that came with the skill was that rotting flesh, depending on how rotten, gave much less to work with. Less of what, or how, it wasn't sure. So even though it had devoured almost a third of the damn rodents, and 2 of the humans, there was just too much stuff to eat, and not enough time, especially with the humid heat inviting an utterly infuriating amount of insects to help the process of decomposition along. For the first dozen or so hours, it was fine, but then it was as if they materialized out of thin air to settle on everything in sight. The buzzing wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that it was so absolutely drenched in blood that it had a near constant cloud of the damn things nibbling at its fur and trying to get into its ears. Anger was a rather rare thing for the wolf. Until now. It hated insects, it decided. They were even more frustrating than the realization that the other female of the humans had unfortunately landed in the trash pits, and this meant it only had 2 humans to devour, as going into the trash pits was a rather swift guarantee it would get stuck and crushed by the gears at the bottom when they started spinning. Well, not a complete guarantee, as it knew there was a gap between the gears that the rats used to clamber up, but close enough to not even consider risking it. It didn't regret helping the human female, as she hadn't been any trouble to it as the hours passed, but that greed in its mind insisted it just go back and kill her. She was defenseless, blind. It would just take one careful snip at the back of her neck to sever her spine. But it refrained, mental resistance, pulling its weight once more to push the greed and bloodlust back. If only that would work on its damn temper, because those stupid flying little things were buzzing, and humming, and constantly ruffling the fur on its inside of its ears as if they were trying to look for a place to burrow, and it was driving it insane. Eventually, it stopped in the middle of chowing down a half-rotted rat, and snarled in frustration as it shook itself free of the flies. For about all of 1 second, before the damn things returned. If only it could, breathe fire, or electricity, or spew those toxic discolored bits of air, or anything to kill these pests. A sound like countless tiny bits of shuffling paper to the side made its head snap up with a dry crackle as the solidified bits of blood on its neck and chest broke apart into chunks, and it got to see the human with her hand up, a bright burst of orange sparks spewing out of her hand in a cone at the large horde of insects trying to settle on her, before tugging her coverings over her head with the same hand as soon as she was finished. A good idea, actually. It should do the same. The important part was that the insects died by the hundreds, and for about 5 whole seconds, the human was free of the annoying flies. Perhaps she wasn't as little of a threat as it thought she was. She was still blind though, and her hearing and sense of smell was likely as useless as any other human's, so she was still relatively harmless, as long as the wolf didn't let its nails scrape the ground and reveal its location if it moved close to her. It could only look on jealously as the girl blasted the insects again, so after a few moments of doing exactly that, it turned back to the rodent at its feet, the motion being accompanied by a bout of sudden dizziness. It stumbled in place for a moment, and after the floor stopped moving under its feet, it realized that it hadn't slept in more than a full light cycle. More than a day. Not a great choice on its part. With a yawn full of annoyance and slowly encroaching exhaustion, it trotted over to the scraped-off remnants of fabric from the human male it had just finished eating an hour ago, and hooked a canine into the biggest piece of fabric it could find, the back portion of the man's covering, and prepared itself for a bout of dizziness. It was just heavy and stiff enough from being soaked in blood that it could easily drape it over its head and ears like one of those weird head coverings humans used, so it tilted its head and moved it side to side to start building momentum as the fabric swung back and forth, and then moved its head in a semicircle to make the fabric drape over its head. It was a bit awkward, and it had to unhook its canine from the fabric using its tongue, but it worked. It really needed to figure out how to make its paws able to switch to human mode. Its own fingers were basically immovable, never mind being useful when trying to handle anything with any sort of dexterity. For a few, long moments, it stood rigid as the world spun, until the feeling of disorientation faded. Its hearing wasn't terribly dampened by the fabric, and it kept the flies away from its ears, so it used what little it could see under the covering to find a decent, dry corner to tuck itself into for a decent sleep, laying its head chin down on the floor with its paws keeping the fabric tight over its ears to keep the flies from waking it up. Its body had been so overworked that it was having trouble snapping itself out of perseverance mode, but after 5 or 10 minutes, it finally fell back to the familiar lucid dream as the symbols welcomed it back. Infection resistance, has leveled up. Level 7 Level 8. Iron stomach, has leveled up. Level 4 Level 6. Mana perception, has leveled up. Level 2 Level 3. Mana manipulation, has leveled up. Level 2 Level 3. Acquired titles. Glutton beyond compare, you have eaten multiple times your body weight over a single uninterrupted period of consumption. You gain +1 to strength and speed while your stomach is adequately filled. Bonus is doubled when your stomach is filled to the brim. That was unfortunate. Its stomach was literally never filled. It all went into the devourer skill storage. Maybe it could find something solid its skill couldn't eat and just have it inside its stomach permanently? That sounded possible, but at the same time, it sounded not only dangerous, but also very difficult to undo. So that wasn't happening, at least for now. A bit disappointed in its new title, it watched the symbols leave, and the devourer skill activated. The rats it had devoured still had plenty to show it, surprisingly, and the information wasn't exclusive to them only. It shared a downright ridiculous amount of similarities to humans, which was absolutely insane to the wolf, as the two creatures couldn't be further apart from the other. But if the symbol said it was true, then it was true. It was still bizarre, however. The process of information rushing to its mind was so much more smoother than before, so much easier, that understanding of said knowledge came like a brick sliding into its place in a wall. Seamless. Down to the cellular level and even deeper into the insides of the cells, it learned all there was to know, the difficulty no larger than remembering an odd mental image it had forgotten. The humans were next, and it noted that part of the reason they were so smart was due to the folds in their brains, not the size of their brains. But it still had no idea how to recreate that intelligence without the possibility of breaking itself, so it left it as something to be thought about later. It looked at the odd way the humans used their tongues and vocal cords, and had an idea. The human girl knew how to use mana to summon that cone of sparks, or that orb of light. Which meant that not only did she know how to use and manipulate the mana, she also knew how to actually turn it into different things. And if it could learn how to communicate with her, through their weird way of yipping and barking and grumbling, it could get the girl to show it how to do it as well. Humans had a far larger variety of ways and sounds to communicate, most of which were probably very specific, so it wasn't too far-fetched of an idea. Its vocal cords were already very similar in structure to the humans, if a lot lower in their pitch and baritone, so it wouldn't even need to do any changes there. It had never tried to speak like a human, but if it could get the girl to start blabbering again, it could sit nearby and try to mimic her. Frankly, it had no idea whatsoever of how to learn another species' method of communication. It believed it was smart enough to do so, especially if it kept putting points in intelligence, which it absolutely planned to, so the only barrier was, what? Time? The other humans didn't seem to be in a rush to grab her. It might have time. Alternatively, it could just drag her into one of the less toxic areas of the last floor with the burning rivers, and keep her there. It would be like keeping and feeding a pup, except it would be larger, needier, and a human. Which was unlikely to work, and the human could easily die from the poisons, not to mention the logical mess that getting her down there was. So it had to hurry and try to learn how to speak human while it still had access to a stuck, defenseless human that couldn't see it. It knew that humans used a combination of their tongue placement, teeth and vocal cords, using the air to make said cords vibrate to create their speech. The problem was that its tongue severely lacked the dexterity that human tongues did, as well as its mouth structure being much different. One of those issues was something it could fix. Its tongue was an essential heat regulator, so it couldn't just pick a human tongue to replace its own, meaning that it would have to do some manual work. The human's biological components fled away, and it was left in the void, not focused enough for the skill to bring forth its own body, lost in thought. The devourer skill had changed somehow. The mental space was not unlike a series of floating knowledge and matter as it was before, but with the vague idea that it could do much more all of a sudden. It just didn't know what that more entailed. It prodded around, trying to figure out what had changed, until eventually, something clicked, the symbols that strengthened it suddenly giving it information. One of the things that had changed was speed. The energy of the skill could change it faster now, as if a pinprick-sized hole had expanded to allow more of the energy to flow between itself and its skill. The other thing that had changed was control and understanding. It could control much more finely what it wanted its resources to be allocated to. And its newfound understanding of how the skill worked was quite enlightening. When it had first gained access to the symbols, or letters, it had thought that it was taking flesh from that odd storage and just placing it on itself, that it was using the bones of the rats to strengthen its own, but that didn't seem to be how the skill actually worked. It simply transported the flesh to a void, somehow, then turned it into an unseen, unfelt energy according to whatever the wolf told the skill to do with it, before using that energy to change its body. It couldn't peer into said energy, its structure and what its conversion rates of flesh to energy were, neither did it get the feeling that it could be able to in the future, but it knew that it wasn't mana. It was something entirely unique. Its curiosity of how the skill worked being sated for the moment, it thought of its body, and with but a thought, its structure appeared, hazy and sharp, invisible and glowing, a shapeless shape. That was new. And it was giving it a headache the more it focused on the visual aspects of it. It used to see itself as it was in its sleeping position with the ability to float around like some detached, airborne eye that could see through layers of solid flesh. Its ability to perceive itself was not visual anymore. It could just feel and become every tiny bit of itself. It was frankly, extremely annoying and disorienting, at least for now, but it was somehow easier and smoother to use the skill, so it tried not to feel disgruntled at the change, focusing on its body instead. By the time it woke up, its antennae would be complete, all its whiskers fallen out to be replaced by long, chitinous organs it could move, covered in microscopic hairs. Just sticking its snout to the ground would allow it to feel every walking human for multiple dozens of feet through the vibrations on the stone, and even just flaring the antennae out would allow it to feel the vibrations on the air, and it could use that along with its ears to precisely pinpoint the source of most, if not all, sounds. The Circe hairs would be complete as well. Just a few extra long hairs among its coat, and it would be able to tell any and all changes in wind direction, allowing it to sneak up on prey better without the wind carrying its scent to said prey, or allowing it to dodge noxious fumes before the breeze blew them into its face. It would also be much less starved in appearance, and the thin layer of fat under its skin would probably double by the time it woke up. Its flesh was slowly but surely growing, and although it was tempted to add more, it could tell that it was already going to be a little oversized to pass as a dog when it grew into an adult, and didn't wish to accentuate that problem. Wolves were naturally bigger than dogs, it seemed. Then it remembered that all the extra tendons would give it a lot of extra muscle mass anyway, and decided to pump a bit more growth hormone into its body. Hopefully by the time it grew into an adult, it would already be too strong to be bothered about humans wondering why it was so much larger than the other dogs. If it decided to even stick around where humans were, for whatever reason. That done, it looked into its storage. And mentally gawked at just how much flesh it had to mess around with. It was a mound of flesh so large it could be used as a small dwelling by a human. It looked to its extra tendons, and prodded around to see how quickly it could have them grow, adding and removing the skill's essence as its mind seamlessly swapped its form for a copy it could experiment with. It could have all the tendon work finished within just 5 days. And although it was skeptical about such fast-paced changes, it had a small mountain's worth of essence, and leaving it sitting there felt like a waste. Up until now it always lived day to day, hour to hour, and now that it had leeway to save up and think of what would happen later, it had to control itself to not just throw all of the skill's essence on its body and hope it worked out. A quick but careful check of its previous work made it notice a few of its new tendons that would snag on its spine and various other bones when doing specific movements, and thus it discarded them. In just 5 days it would be almost twice as physically strong, assuming its rather amateurish attempts at adding more tendons would work as it had envisioned. The mere thought made it giddy, its tail wagging against ground sticky with half-dried blood in the real world. It peered into its body more closely, noting things that were beneficial and those that weren't, and noted that it had a rather puny amount of those things called vitamins, and thus dedicated about 20 rats worth of essence to generate more and pump it into its bloodstream slowly over time. Its bones were hardening quickly, and the process would be finished in a couple days, and while hardening them further was tempting, it also wanted to keep itself sort of light, just because of the unsafe, rickety grounds it sometimes had to cross, and to conserve more energy as it moved around. Its changes sped up significantly when it slept, for some reason, so it realized that if it wanted to change faster, it could just sleep constantly, something that it mentally noted to do more from now on. It could get rid of some of the fat it decided to put on itself to shed more weight, but the fat was added for the purposes of insulation from both the electricity thing, and to keep its body warm, so it let it be for now. It looked for any other improvements it could make, and after a moment, realized that it had a problem. There was a lot of flesh in storage and little to spend its essence on. Its intestines were also currently in the process of being dissolved by the skill, and after a bit of nudging, it realized that it could have that part finished by the time it woke up, leaving it with a lot of empty space in its body, the jointed miniature ribcage of bone it had placed under its abdominal muscles to be ready in perhaps 7 to 8 days, or light cycles. So its abdomen would hopefully not be so grimly thin it would draw attention. The lack of intestines would actually make it much lighter, but still, it felt like a waste for its abdomen to just be a film of muscle over a few shoddy bones. But what could it put in there? Maybe an additional lung? But it had no idea how that would be in a fight. If it had to clench its abdomen, its lung would get squeezed, so that wasn't quite viable. Liver? Oh, wait. It didn't need a liver, did it? It helped with production of bile, which it did not need, production of certain proteins for blood plasma, which some essence could easily take care of instead, and it helped with producing something called cholesterol and some specific proteins that would help it carry fats through its body, which was another thing the devourer skill could take care of, and at about the same energy efficiency. After much deliberation, it decided to keep its liver, as it assisted in its internal structural integrity, and it had nothing to fill that space with for the moment. In general, it let its insides remain much the same, and then focused on its muscles. It considered making them harder or more resilient, but that would also probably make its movements stiffer and its muscles less stretchy, so after dedicating some essence to fully repair every single small injury on its body as it slept, including the regeneration of the tiny hairs on the inside of its cochlea that gave it the ability to hear, and fully restoring its sense of smell and taste, it turned to feel its body a bit more for anything more it could fix or improve. After some deliberation and mental fumbling, it managed to make its body cut most of its hairs on its upper body in half, just to get rid of all that extra weight from the crusted filth it couldn't reach before with its teeth. Filth that had dense-ned significantly from its feast, at least on the underside of its neck and chest. It was mildly embarrassed it hadn't thought of doing that before. Still, it was incredible how much fine control the skill allowed the wolf to have over its body, to the point it could pinpoint specific hairs and cut them to specific lengths by just dissolving the unwanted or overly long bits into the skill's storage. It then checked its eyes for progress, and tried to see how much it could rush the process along. It wanted better sight, was absolutely intrigued at the idea of more colors, and pushed that process as much as it reasonably could. It was ready to dump half the mountain of rats into the process, but after a certain point, it just refused to be further sped up, some sort of bottleneck in place preventing it. So it carefully tuned the maximum amount of flesh it could turn to, and in about 10 days, it would be able to see new colors, for the cost of about only 10 rats. It tried to imagine how that would even look, but much in the same way it could not imagine the sky when all it had known were pipes and darkness. Despite knowing what it conceptually was, it could not imagine the colors the humans saw. And finally, its tongue. The reason that human tongues were so dexterous was that they were purely muscle and taste buds, while its own tongue had substantially less of both in exchange for much higher blood flow to the organ, which was used to regulate its heat. So, after much fiddling, it figured out a way to put more muscle fibers into the organ without restricting the blood flow too much, thus making its tongue a bit more dexterous in exchange for slightly less efficiency in its body cooling abilities, forcing the change to happen in mere hours, thanks to the low volume of flesh produced. It didn't even have to rush the process along. Then it looked at its storage of roughly 1.5 human bodies, and assigned them as nutrients. They had no real difference from the rat meat besides their higher quality flesh being equivalent to more essence, but it preferred eating humans over the furry rats, so for the sake of mental organization, it would put humans as food. As soon as it thought that it had nothing more to see or change, its consciousness faded entirely, and it peacefully slept, hours passing by in moments. Until a shrill scream startled it awake. The crunching, the buzzing, They never stopped, even long after she'd covered her head and ears with a torn piece of her robe, even long after the beast had gone silent. The hours passed by like nails raking down her back, long, painful, slow. She focused on the letters floating in her mind, clinging to them. Not because of the skills she'd gained, nor the singular level she'd gotten from being dragged on the quest to kill the rats, but because it was all she could see. She'd heard that blind people and animals with no concept of language would see the system as a series of concepts and ideas, and part of her had wondered what it would be like now that she no longer had sight. And to her great relief, that hadn't happened. She could still see the system's information, faint white letters floating in place in her mind, as if she could still see. So she stared at the window with eyes that weren't there, just to indulge in what she could no longer have outside her own head. Species, humanoid. Race, elf. Name, Imhriel. Paths, Infuser, level 7. Base attributes. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +0. Perception, +0. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +4. Soul, +2. Available, 0. Racial skills, attuned, quick learner. Acquired skills. Magic resistance, level 5. Mental resistance, level 6. Poison resistance, level 4. Pain resistance, level 8. Illumina, level 6. Spark burst, level 12. Haste, level 9. Mana perception, level 15. Mana manipulation, level 9. Acquired traits. Kind-hearted, 1/3. You have shown yourself capable of both sympathy and empathy, and have backed up your emotions with actions that you believe were moral. Gain +1 in soul and resolve when helping sentient beings as long as you do not assist them with committing actions you find immoral. She focused on her one and only gain trait with the acidic, bitter taste of resentment. Were she not kind, would she have some other path that would save her? Some spell that could kill the monster prowling around her? That could help her regain her sight? Focusing on the past, she'd learned, was among the most meaningless things anyone could do. But so was everything else right now. So she continued, her mind rolling down a well-walked spiral, until she was so deep that everything faded under a thin veil of despair. How long until she was rescued? Did she even want to be rescued? Without her eyes, she couldn't even tell how much time had passed. It might have been 2 days, or it might have been 6. She was so dehydrated. She was so hungry. Maybe she should just anger the monster on purpose. Bare her throat, make it quick. Because she couldn't find any other way to escape her predicament. She had nothing, nobody. Even her fumbling attempts to attract the monster to her, to see how amicable it was, in the vain hope of it being some bound creature or some summon she could befriend, had done nothing to attract its attention. How much longer could she last without water? She had no idea, but the headache pounding in her skull didn't give her much confidence. Yet she could do nothing but stay rooted in place, withering away like a poisoned plant. Or she could just stick her palm against the holes where her eyes used to be, and activate spark burst. Minutes passed in silence, her mind slowly growing foggy. She thought of a warm bed, a cool glass of water. Pain suddenly registered as tears came out of her tear ducts to pool into the sensitive holes of her sockets, and she hissed, hurriedly trying to tilt her head to the side to let them drip to the side of her face. Unable to do anything, she let the minutes pass her by as she sat there, her mind slowly emptying of all thought, slipping into a fugue. Then, in an instant forged out of a piece of her consciousness, her sight returned. The staircase wobbled under her feet as she watched Keezy speed past them with the haste spell she demanded, leaving them behind, the horde at her heels. Something snapped, a scream tore at her throat as she lost her footing, and then her world was nothing but fur, and teeth, and agony, blunt teeth yanking bits of her flesh off as the world began spinning, the spark burst spell on her right hand burning her own skin, eyes ripped out of their sockets, teeth snagged on tendons, fingers tearing, the clicking of teeth, the shrieking. She woke up with a terrified scream, attempting to bolt upright and open eyes that weren't there anymore and only managing to raise her torso a couple inches off the ground before gasping and laying back down. She panted in pain and panic from the sudden jerk of wakefulness jostling her broken limbs, and for a moment she simply breathed in the miasma of rot in the air, until her brain remembered her predicament, and she relaxed back onto the stone as best as she could. The scrape of nails on stone neared, and she took in a shaky breath as she tried to muffle her whimpers of pain. Despite the fact that she just wanted to give up, she was scared. She didn't want to die, so she tightened her throat, grit her teeth. Yet, much to her dismay, the clicking nails kept getting closer. Logic told her that if it wanted to kill her, it would have done so ages ago, but her mind kept conjuring the stomach-churning sounds of the thing battling the rats, the horrid, endless sound of crunching bone and tearing flesh. She didn't need eyes to hear its pacing, to know it was right next to her, circling around her as if deciding what to do with her now that all its food had rotted away. She could be next, a realization both comforting and horrifying in equal measure. Her heartbeat hammered away in her chest. Minutes passed in relative silence, and then a singular bark, far too loud to be coming from a canine of the size she remembered, broke the silence, and she flinched. And then, silence, once more. Yet slowly but surely, shrill squeaking came closer and closer, and she could only tremble in fear and hope the monster would protect her. The wolf could only guess what made the human scream. Maybe a dream, maybe it tried to move, only to feel whatever injury it had, but despite circling around her thrice, it could find no new injury or threat besides a single rat in the opposite end of the pit. The vermin would slowly come back, now that they thought the danger was away, so it would probably be best to move the human far away from the lip of the hole, and somewhere where the wolf could keep her close. If she died, that would be unfortunate, but it was going to make damn sure the human didn't die before it learned how to move the mana or at least how to communicate a bit. Now that it was certain there was little danger, it sat on its haunches, and accessed its body. Not only did it feel amazing, it looked amazing compared to before. The excess fur covered in filth had mostly disappeared from its body, making it feel just a bit lighter after shaking off the chunks of blood and dirt. That lightness was somewhat offset by its additional fat and a bit more muscle, which the wolf was more than grateful for, but with its intestines gone, it was still about as light as when the symbols came to its mind for the first time, despite all its added bulk. It almost couldn't see the outline of its ribs anymore, and the rest of its body was similarly filled out. Just a couple days more and it wouldn't even look or be malnourished. It spun in a quick circle, just to feel the air on its new Circe hairs, pleased with how easy it was to know how the wind moved around its body. A mild advantage, but a welcome one. The Circe hairs were strange. There was little to no airflow down here, so it had to spin a couple more times to figure out how each sensation of displaced air felt, from pushing it out of the way to the air retreating around its form on the other side, but it got a grasp of it fairly quickly. The thing it was most excited about, however, were the antennae. It was like having a dozen extra tiny, flexible tentacles on the end of its snout. Moving each one individually felt as natural as twitching an ear. A bit of experimentation in individually moving more than two of them in opposing directions proved it difficult, as if strings had them tied together and it simply couldn't extend an antennae too far in the opposite direction. But it was definitely possible. It wasn't a biological restriction, but more one that had to do with coordination. Experimentally, it pressed them flat on its snout to hide them, disliking how intense the sensation of the antennae burrowing into its snout hair was. The miniature hair on the antennae were a bit more sensitive than it had expected, and the sensation of hiding them into its fur felt much like having an overly sensitive area rub against rough fabric. Not painful, but overloading to the point of it almost being so. It suspected that was largely due to the fact it had removed pain sensors from the organs, rather than the sensation actually not being painful. Then it decided to flare them all out at once, all 14 twitching antennae, and the world deepened. Or rather, its perception of the world did. Even from the simple vibrations in the air, it could very faintly feel distant impacts and hums, mechanical and not. It lowered its snout to the ground, its flexible antennae moving erratically, brushing against each other and the ground. There was just so much information in an instant, that for a moment, it felt overwhelmed, prompting it to yank its head up. After a few seconds of preparation, it shook itself and bent down once more. It was like getting a tactile sensation of everything in contact with the stone below its feet, the sensation peaking with vibrations of varying strength. It felt that the gears of the hole were arranged in a sort of grid made of lines and levels, the lines of gears at the top row further apart than the ones below, repeating for 5 levels until anything that made it out of the bottom would be smashed together. It felt places where the stone's vibrations magnified and condensed, into pipes and stairways buried into the sides of the pit, into rooms full of moving metal. It felt like the gears, which were metal. The pit was already gigantic, but knowing just how much more there was to its sides and underneath, made it feel completely dwarfed. But it didn't matter. Because it could feel almost all of it. Its tail wagged with so much strength that its hips were forced to move side to side in a sort of overly excited wiggle, and it sniffed at the ground once more, before stomping a paw, its eyes closed. It couldn't see, but it could feel. There were pipes of metal running through the stone, rooms embedded in the sides, accessible through other tunnels it couldn't feel the entirely of, cubes of stone full of inert machinery waiting to start spinning the gears. There were tiny impacts following a pattern and unstable path, that it quickly realized were actually rodents as they scurried out of the pipes. There was some complicated mechanism connected by pipes running up the walls to the wolf's sides and towards the top of the pit. Connected to 4 metal boxes, inside which were complicated bits of wires and metals. The human behind it shifted, just a tad, but the light thud of her head hitting the stone told it exactly where she was, even if the impact was muffled by her hair. It slowly peeled back more and more of its antennae as it continued reading the vibrations around itself, noticing that it could feel and sense less and less with every peeled back organ. It was like having a dozen ears that all worked in harmony to send it clear signals. It was amazing. It was so happy that it honestly didn't know what to do with itself, so it nailed its eyes to the singular rat on the other side of the pit, gathered as much air as it could in its lungs, and barked all of it out at once with a booming bark that made its throat hurt a bit, the sound easily carrying to the other side of the massive pit. The rat turned at the sound and spotted it, and started its long, frenzied journey around the edge of the pit towards the wolf, who genuinely started feeling its tail growing sore from its wagging. A celebration with a snack, what more could it want? It lowered its snout to the ground, just to confirm that the mounds of trash would muffle the sound of its bark enough to the rats down there to not attract more than it could handle, and besides a low buzz of activity from a couple that were already near the top, it was silent. It hopped back and forth in place just a bit before directing its gaze to a plate of metal on the wall behind it and trying to visualize if it could accurately toss the rat onto its center, just as a test of accuracy, or rather, a game. And froze in place as it saw another wolf, ears shooting straight up. Wait, no, that wasn't right. It tilted its head, and the other wolf did the exact same. It thought back to how light interacted with the human and wolven retinas and pupils, and realized what was happening. A reflection. A reflection that was wrong. It moved its head, flared its antennas in specific patterns as it approached, the reflection a perfect mimicry of its actions, but not its form. It mimicked exactly how the wolf moved and acted, if mildly distorted from detritus and a thin layer of moss growing on the shiny plate. But its eyes were glowing in the reflection. It hadn't done anything to its eyes that would do that. There was no light entering and reflecting the lining in its eyes right now. They were just glowing. 2 yellow circles of gold with the background of a mangy-looking canine, on a dirty plate of metal. Why were its eyes glowing? No other canine it had seen ever had glowing eyes. Even as the furious squeak slowly got closer, it couldn't look away, confused and worried. If its eyes were glowing, why hadn't it noticed? Why did its eyes not see that light that seemingly radiated out of its iris? It made no sense. Was the light only visible from a certain angle, allowing it to not be bothered by the golden luminescence? From simple logic, all it should be able to see would be a bright yellow light, even if it closed its eyes. So it probably had to do with the thing that broke logic, which were the symbols. After it spent a minute thinking, it couldn't really remember anything eye-related in the symbols besides the title Witness of Divinity. Could it turn that off somehow? Because the more it looked at its own glowing eyes, the more it started to realize that blending in with other canines was going to be much harder than it thought. It made sense now why humans kept giving it second looks, and why it was suddenly drawing so much more attention than it was used to. The humans probably kept pausing to see if its eyes were reflecting some light from some strange angle, or if they were actually glowing. The shrill squeaks came closer and closer as the humans started breathing faster, whimpering short words at the sound that the wolf didn't care to register, and it turned to rush at the rat, no longer in a good mood. One swipe, bite, and thrash of the vermin later, it wrenched its head to the side and accurately slammed it into the plate of metal with a rattling bang, and got back to thinking, only idly checking for any more rodents that would disturb it. Hunting with its eyes giving away its position like that was going to be really difficult, at least against anything with any semblance of self-preservation and wariness. There had to be a way it could turn it off, because otherwise, it would be nothing but a detriment to its survival. It knew that traits couldn't be turned off, because it had asked the symbols if it could, but it hadn't considered asking if titles could be turned off. Skills like its resistances could be mentally dialed up and down, even if it was awake, with little more than a thought, but trying to focus on that title and asking the symbols to disable it did nothing. Maybe it could just make new eyes. Or would those be affected too? The symbols sometimes answered its questions, so when it slept again, it was going to have a lot of them. For the moment, it couldn't do anything about the glow, so it simply turned to the human, who was still breathing harshly, and tried to consult its internal clock. It had been 2 days since it broke the staircase? The human must be starving, and would definitely need some liquid to survive. It glanced at the shredded rat lying limp under the metal plate, tilting its head as it tried to remember what human stomachs were designed for. Yeah, that would work. Not the safest, because human stomachs were weak to raw meat, but it didn't have many options to feed her. Plus, if she cared that much, she could just burn the thing with her mana fire thingy and eat it after drinking the blood. Blood was about 9/10 water content, so all it had to do was grab some rats, bleed them into her mouth, and then let her do whatever she wanted with the meat, and she should theoretically survive. As it gripped the rat in its jaws and trotted back to the human, it began to wonder if the girl was really worth all the trouble, and tried not to think how suspiciously long it was taking for the humans to come pick her up. At this rate, it was starting to come up with escape plans of its own, just in case the humans never showed up. The wolf paused for a moment, and put the rodent on the floor. The human couldn't digest the hair on the rodent, and the guts of the rat were a thing so vile that it was only thanks to the devourer skill that the wolf itself could nonchalantly eat them. Not to mention, it was highly likely the human would get sick from ingesting rat blood, which could result in puking, which would only dehydrate her further, and could potentially make keeping her alive harder. Of course that wasn't a guarantee, as every human it had devoured had slightly different strengths and biological capabilities, but it was likely. There were also other problems that would build up were it to feed her rat's blood. For example, humans had trouble getting rid of the iron in their foods and bodies, so feeding her rat blood would give an iron overload. That would lead to various annoying and potentially dangerous issues, but only in the long term. Another more obvious issue, and one that would occur with near certainty, was disease. That, the rats carried plenty of. It didn't know what diseases exactly, nor how they worked, but the microorganisms inside the rats and the substances on the rats could seriously mess up a weak human, especially since it probably didn't have any skills and natural resistances to such things like the wolf did. That actually explained a long-time question it held about why humans rarely ate rats. Although burning the meat would probably solve most of those issues, there was also the problem of hunting the rats. One bite from them could be seriously difficult to deal with for things with weaker immune systems than itself, like humans. The amount of filth and bacteria in their mouths could easily kill someone if a bite was left untreated. As it raked its teeth through the rodent's corpse, slowly peeling off its fur and yanking out its intestines, which it quickly ate, it thought of alternative solutions to keep the human alive. It could create a sack of skin on its leg, and direct a bunch of blood to be formed inside it from the devourer skill, before making a small hole in it and letting the human drink the blood. It was a bit of a bastardization of the design of human mammaries, but it didn't particularly care about how sanitary or uncomfortable something like a skin sack full of excess blood would be when it could easily hook a canine on it and just cut it off. It would be painless, and not terribly difficult to form, design, or get rid of. So long as it kept the human alive, it was an option worth considering. The wolf wouldn't even become anemic, as the blood would be provided by the devourer skill's essence. So while that triggered a bit of an offensive feeling, to do such a thing to itself, it could do it, and its blood was undeniably far better quality than rodent blood. It could also tweak its blood to be higher in water content, as well as pump more vitamins and minerals into it so that it would be even closer to water, and thus keep the human healthier. Actually, couldn't it just create water? Biological understanding was based on several dozen concepts and ideas that the wolf shouldn't understand, like chemicals, electrical signals, energy and heat generation, and various other small tidbits that were necessary, but otherwise unrelated to biology, and more related to how the world itself worked. It was a curious thing, that the wolf learned of them anyway. Yet it didn't feel like those extra bits were taught by the skill. It felt like information pulled out of nowhere on the spot, and shoved into its mind to fit whatever it was curious or focused on at the moment, rather than information so well placed it was like remembering something previously forgotten, which was how information taught by the symbols felt like. And that odd learning process had started long before the symbols appeared. It felt like something other, something different that it didn't know about, working with the skill to teach it. Something to be considered and explored later. As it focused back on its task ahead, it believed that it technically could reduce the blood plasma content of its blood until it would essentially just be slightly slimier water. The question was if it cared enough to change its body like that by applying that skin sack idea onto itself, even if temporarily, just to avoid getting the human sick. The answer to which, for the moment, was a firm no. It likely didn't have that long with her anyway, and then her kin would arrive and help her, so it was going to stick to its original plan. The bigger problem would be communicating and getting close to the human without scaring her into throwing mana things at it like those sparks. After biting off the rat's head, forcing its hide down its throat, and carefully chewing through its organs, all that was left was a husk of bloody flesh, which it hooked onto its canines, before carefully trotting to the side where the human's unusable arm lay. In case it tried to do something with mana from its hands or something else, the wolf would have more time to react from the injured side, or so it hoped. It raised a paw with a short chuff through the meat in its maw to alert the human to its presence, and poked it in the side, prompting her to jerk in surprise. Hello? The girl squeaked out in acknowledgement, and the wolf grumbled lightly back, in a sort of greeting. Not that it was at all sure if the human would understand its meaning, but hopefully that would eventually be solved. It walked around her shoulders to position itself above her head, its mind just as focused on the blood being wasted with every moment it wasn't dripping into her mouth as it was focused on the human for any sudden movements. It clumsily raised a paw, and prodded her cloth-covered head this time, making sure to have its nails unable to cut. They had no way of communicating, but it had to find a way to tell her what it was doing, so physical touch would have to work. "You don't understand me, alright?" It whispered, shying away from the wolf's touch by tilting its head away, and the wolf sensed her fear slowly evaporating as the seconds passed by while it clumsily tried to tug the head covering off her mouth. The head covering was a great idea from her, considering the open wounds that were her eyes, so while it was tempted to just yank it off, it refrained, largely due to the presence of the flies. If they were anything like cockroaches, they wouldn't hesitate to plant their eggs in her eye sockets, which would be. Just the thought made it shudder. Getting rid of something like that would be horrible. While it was good that the human was suddenly less scared, it didn't care all that much, carefully balancing the act of moving its paw to drag the fabric off her mouth with the act of paying attention to her mana and constantly twitching its ears to be rid of all the flies that were still buzzing around. Most of said flies were focused on the rotting corpses, thankfully, but that still left a ton of them to bother itself and the human. As soon as it got the bloodied fabric bunched up under her nose, it tilted its head to see better, and aligned the rodent's neck stump with her lips, watching the drops of crimson gather before slowly dripping downwards. The process of skinning and eating its organs had significantly drained the rodent of blood, which was a bit annoying. There was probably little more than a handful or so that it could drip into her mouth before all the blood trapped in its veins and muscles would stop moving. The first drop met her chapped lips and trickled down to the side of her mouth, her head already turned away from the wolf. The human stiffened, but the wolf sensed no mana being involved with the way it clenched its working fist, and remained in place. Another drop, and another, and her tongue curiously flit out between her lips to taste the blood. And she stiffened even further, bunching her shoulders up near her neck, despite her injured arm being jostled by the movement. It gave a short grumble, partly to comfort the skittish human, and partly to rush her along, because it watched a drop trickle down her cheek, utterly wasted. It was just blood. Fairly vile blood, sure, but would she rather die of dehydration than eat something gross? Humans were not only built extremely strangely from a biological standpoint, they were also utterly illogical. Another drop trickled down her lips, and the wolf grumbled again, more forcefully, putting a paw on her mouth and pulling her bottom lip down just enough for a couple drops to enter her mouth. She would only survive 3 to 4 days without water, and it was already around 2.5 days since she'd come into the pit with her team. So the fact that she wrenched her head to the side and out from under its paw was highly frustrating to the wolf. Another couple drops were wasted. Just as it was about to give up and eat the rodent by itself, the human turned her head up towards the wolf, and hesitantly opened her mouth with her mouth scrunched up into a sort of grimace. Finally, they were getting somewhere. For a couple minutes, the wolf stood in place, weathering the discomfort of the annoying insects to let the human drink. Sometimes it had to pause and rake its nails through the flesh to make the corpse bleed a bit more, and sometimes the flies would try and enter the human's mouth and she had to twitch her facial muscles and blow out air to make them go away, but regardless of those interruptions, around a small cupful of liquid was extracted in the 15 or so minutes it took to hydrate the human. It chuffed through its teeth once it decided it was done standing in place, and put the rat's mutilated remains on the floor, quickly devouring it. The human would survive for a while without food, and digestion needed water which would further dehydrate the human, so it wouldn't even say that it was being greedy for eating the rodent without trying to get her to eat first. Even if it was mostly motivated by greed. It could, after all, put the food into much better use than the human could. The girl made some gagging noises shortly after swallowing the final, small mouthful, but settled down quickly as it chomped down the rat in a few final bites. Raking its nails through the flesh had made it exceptionally easy to tear apart and swallow. As soon as it clacked its teeth shut for the final time, licking bits of gore and blood off its chops, the human took a deep breath and softly spoke. "Thank you." The wolf didn't understand, but it chuffed again, and moved to the human's injured side before settling down on its haunches as the human pulled the bloodied fabric down to her chin again. Now, to try and speak. The sound of thank you that the girl made was relatively simple compared to the frenzied gibberish they used with each other sometimes, so it was a good base for it to start. It just didn't know how to start. That, and it remembered that it had to get the human up the stairs before more rodents started showing up. Trying to communicate with the human while surrounded by rats was just asking to die. The rodents didn't exactly investigate every sound, but they would at least turn towards it just to check, like any animal. And if they thought that something was alive, they'd rush at it. Making sure to make as much noise as it could reasonably make as it walked back up towards the human's head, simply to not make it panic, it mentally prepared itself for hard labor, and with one last searching look for any nearby rodents, it chuffed again, and bent down to the human's left shoulder. It slowly bit down, making its teeth only partially cut through, and as soon as its canines bit through the tough covering and pricked the human's skin, made them not cut at all. With blood rush, ready at the merest hint of mana or movement of the human's uninjured hand, it leaned its body weight back, and started pulling. Even with its natural strength, far greater than any normal canine of its size, it instantly realized just how difficult it would be to drag her up an entire loop of stairs. Its body weight was too light to give it any great assistance in dragging the human. Even if it leaned all the way back and pushed with its paws, it was still far too small to easily drag humans around. It could only hazard a guess that it was some sort of feeding frenzy that allowed it to drag the even heavier male earlier. Still, it heaved back, and the human started slowly moving, one tiny bit at a time. And with that movement, came pain, the human's breath hitching as she sucked in air through her teeth in a sort of warning hiss, a sound which made the wolf tense, ready to snap its jaws open and turn its head to tear her throat out in an instant if she tried anything. That, or at least use the human's fear to make it rethink any notion of attacking. After a moment, the human relaxed a bit, its breathing strained from pain. "Sorry," it said, and the wolf took it as a signal to continue. Which it did, sometimes having to separate from her to kick some rotting rodents out of their path, before darting back and slowly dragging the human to safety through her grunts and groans and harsh breaths. Just to experiment, it tried to invite that strange bloodlust that came from its skill again, even starting to think of random things that might trigger it. Imaginations of battle and danger seemed to do nothing, so it began imagining that at the top of the stairs would be a huge mound of meat, nurturing that image, and just the tiniest trickle of power entered its limbs at the mere prospect of feeding. That was so strange. It explained much, but it was also a highly restrictive power. That, and it wasn't terribly potent. Dragging the human got a bit easier, but that was about it. Still, it could trick the skill into empowering itself with the power of imagination, so that was an important discovery. A rat eventually noticed them, one of the very few that made their way back up to the pit's lip, and it instantly rushed forth. The excitement of battle was somewhat muted by now, especially due to how every fight with a rat went the same way. They just stupidly rushed at it. Batter it onto its side, grab, disorient and slam into the floor, and that was that. It let the rat's corpse be for now, judging the human to temporarily be more important. The staircase was a circular thing that jutted out of the sizable sides of the pit, all easily more than 50 feet wide, and despite having cut off a part of it and having walked up and down its entire length, it still felt daunting to tread up, especially when it had to drag a human along. A human that, despite being in very obvious pain, judging by her constant whines and groans, was being thankfully compliant with the wolf, even as it began to lift her torso up the first few steps. Or, she was, until a hand shakily raised to touch its neck. A hand that, in the last millisecond, it noticed had a faint sense of mana coating it, like an invisible mist that it felt more than saw. The wolf made its teeth cut through the cloth and instantly leapt back a step, raising a throaty warning snarl, ready to activate, blood rush, and kill the human. One bite in almost any spot in her body, and she would bleed out while the wolf danced away from her mana constructs. The human froze solid, her hand trembling, and the faint scent of fear entered its nostrils, something it felt like it wouldn't even be able to detect without that singular point in perception. I am sorry. I'm sorry. It's a haste spell. I'm sorry. It whimpered, laying its quivering hand back onto the floor, her chest moving up and down with her uneven breaths as the faint sense of mana around her hand dissipated. Accepting her swift submission, it stopped the rumbling growl in its chest and relaxed its lips to cover its teeth again. It was expecting the human to try and hurt it, yet it still felt a faint sense of betrayal all the same. A coil of anger formed at the bottom of its stomach, aimed at the girl for attempting to hurt it, especially after all the help it had given her, when it could have easily bit through her nape and gotten itself a delicious meal. It sped up in its quest to put her somewhere safer, no longer caring about how much pain she was in, simply wanting to be done with its task. It hooked its teeth back into another spot on her garment that was intact enough to support its pull without tearing, activated blood rush, and quickly dragged her gurgling, sobbing form up, step by shaky step, the sounds of the human accompanied by the scrape of metal as her iron-clad feet were dragged up the metal planks. 3 loops up, and they wouldn't even be bothered by the flies, so that was where it decided to put her. The human kept whimpering and groaning shakily, showing every sign possible that it was in pain, and after the first loop, the wolf's anger had dissipated along with blood rush, and thus, with a hint of hesitation, it slowed. The human panted, and the wolf really wanted to join her in that particular activity, because as soon as the little boost it gained from imagining a pile of meat on the top of the stairs left, combined with its anger and blood rush, it felt half as strong as it did mere moments ago. It could drag her up later, it decided, and after moving her towards the railing in a position that wouldn't tug or put pressure on her injuries, as a sort of reward for not being too difficult besides that little sneak attack incident, it finally unhooked its teeth from the torn garment. Oh! Its gums and jaws felt absolutely wrecked. It didn't even know its gums could feel sore. Which made it wonder what would happen if a tooth were to fall out. Would it be able to regrow the tooth, and if so, would it still have the properties of its current teeth? It most definitely did not want to find out, so it tried its best to remember to severely reinforce its gums when it got to sleep. That done, it quickly walked back down the stairs to go pick up the rat it had killed earlier. The human could probably use a bit more fluid, assuming the rodent hadn't already bled it all out on the stone. It made a mental note to cut less with its teeth when dealing with rats it could afford to kill by just slamming them into the floor, and it quickly walked around the railing on the final step as its paws met stone once more, heading to the rat's corpse just 24 feet away. It bit into the holes it had already made when it killed it just to not waste more of its blood, before turning around and trotting back up the stairs. The last few drops of blood dripped into the human's mouth, and the wolf turned its head and dropped the rodent on the stairs, pinning it in place with one paw so it wouldn't slide out from the gap under each step, and started tearing out chunks of it at a time. It quickly ate the rat, and then moved to lie down just a step above the human, towards its injured side. Right now it just wanted to try speaking like humans did. After a few moments of playing around with its tongue to test its dexterity more properly, it decided to try. "On hoyu." It started, the sound coming off more like a low howl than anything resembling human speech, much less the thank you sound. The human didn't react at all to its howl besides slightly turning her head, likely more out of curiosity than anything else. It tilted its head, racking its brain. That didn't work at all. Deciding to take the sound and break it into 3 different parts, like the NK and U, it started practicing. The results were less than stellar, even as hours passed by with nothing but broken, strange howls and growls coming out of its mouth while the dim lights from above illuminated the shifting clouds of flies around them. Speaking in human tongue had 3 components. Their larynx, that was essentially long, smooth bands of muscle on the front of their throat that helped shape their voice, in a structure that was almost identical to the wolf's, their vocal cords, which added inflection, depth and complexity to the sound, and their tongue and mouth, which shaped the more precise, intricate sounds that they couldn't make purely with their throat. The main problem the wolf had was about that last component. The length of its mouth was one difference. If it wanted to blow out air while positioning its tongue the right way to make the hissing sound of th, it would have to exhale a bit harder, because its throat and the front of its snout were much further apart than it was in humans. Another difference, a bigger one, would be its tongue. The NK sound wasn't much easier. It had a snappiness to it. The wolf had to hum while trapping air in its throat by spreading out its tongue to form a seal, thus making the N part, then stop humming and exhale while suddenly pulling its tongue flat on the bottom of its mouth, releasing the pent-up air to form the K in a sort of clicking sound. And that was really hard. There was barely enough muscle in its tongue to properly do it, and it required a lot more effort than the wolf would have expected. The U part was relatively easy to do, thankfully. So while it believed that it could communicate simple sounds like thank you once it learned how to make and cobble those various smaller sounds together, it had realized that speaking in complex sounds like a human would be harder than it had anticipated. But far from impossible. It would have to expand its throat, make its tongue bigger by adding more musculature for finer control, and practice a bunch, and then it could speak exactly like a human, if with a bit more growl in its sounds. With that thought acting as the closing note to its efforts for the moment, it decided it was done for the day, and could really use some sleep. It really wanted to speed up its body's progress, even if the sensation of new things suddenly being put inside it was mildly uncomfortable. The changes were so fast that its body wasn't able to entirely ignore them, so it could feel several inert tendons stretch ever so slightly with every movement of its torso. After a session that was several hours long, its head felt like someone had cracked its skull open to stuff it full of hay. Mental exhaustion was no new feeling, but it was still highly unpleasant. In contrast, its body was well rested, so it got up, and cautiously leaned its head down to bite into the human's garment again. Despite the headache that her sounds were whenever anything disturbed her, it wasn't going to leave the human down here, simply for safety's sake. 2 loops of stairs left to go. With its eyes nailed onto the human's left hand for the merest twitch, it activated, blood rush, and heaved back. Fuck, the human groaned out in pain, a rather simple sound, which the wolf decided to learn how to say later. The task and its completion were rather mundane. It had to stop multiple times to wait for blood rush to return before resuming, and besides feeling like its teeth were about to fall out of its gums and its legs feeling like they were made of slime, nothing of note happened. It left the human resting on the steps and trotted a little further up the staircase, went to the edge where the slabs of iron were the widest, and laid down on its side to sleep. It was out like a light within moments, the symbols quickly forming in its mind. Dash, restful awareness, has leveled up. Level 5 Level 6. Dash, iron stomach, has leveled up. Level 6 Level 7. Dash, blood rush, has leveled up. Level 2 Level 3. Remove traits. Timid, 1/5 You have fled from danger equal or lesser to yourself multiple times. You are slightly faster when running away. It thought about the removed trait with a sense of dissatisfaction. That added speed when defending itself or running away was really valuable. Surviving mattered more than attacking. Its rather haphazard plan was to go to the place with the toxic rivers and ambush humans to eat, or simply go around visiting the various trash pits full of rodents around the city. That was all it really needed to do. If anything, timid was more helpful than it was detrimental, so its loss was rather grating to the wolf. The Devourer skill activated, but rather than showing it a deconstruction of what it had consumed, it was taken straight to the portion where it observed its body. It had, assumedly, nothing more to learn from rats, which was understandable. It looked around for something to improve, but could find no reasonable alterations it hadn't thought of, so besides quickly toughening up its gums and healing them a little bit from the strain it put them through, it simply settled for checking its progress. Then, it decided to give itself a bit of a reminder on the progress of the symbols, bringing up all of its achievements with a thought. Species, wolf. Name, none. Path, Hound of the Keeper, level 8. Base attributes. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +2. Perception, +1. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +3. Soul, +1. Available, 0. Racial skills, Pack Hunter, Quick Learner, Devourer. Acquired skills. Pain resistance, level 17. Infection resistance, level 8. Poison resistance, level 12. Corrosion resistance, level 5. Disease resistance, level 4. Magic resistance, level 4. Mental resistance, level 28. Electricity resistance, level 2. Restful awareness, level 6. Tough skin, level 2. Iron stomach, level 7. Mana perception, level 3. Mana manipulation, level 3. Soul perception, level 2. Echoes of Oblivion, level 1. Blood rush, level 3. Acquired titles. Witness of divinity, you have seen a being of divine nature in their own realm. Your illuminated gaze shatters all illusions, and pierces through any and all falsehoods. Glutton beyond compare, you have eaten multiple times your body weight over a single uninterrupted period of consumption. You gain +1 to strength and speed while your stomach is adequately filled. Bonus is doubled when your stomach is filled to the brim. Acquired traits. Enduring, 1/5 you have felt the chill of death multiple times, and survived. You are slightly tougher. Hunter, 1/2 you hunt living creatures, whether it is for survival, sport or personal gain of one manner or another. You are slightly harder to notice when intending to hunt. Its memory refreshed, it started prodding witness of divinity, to try and find a way to turn it off or get rid of it entirely, before eventually giving up at the lack of response it was getting. Its glowing eyes would just keep being a problem that the wolf would have to work around, whether it liked it or not. Its consciousness slipped back into limbo, and it rested soundly. The canine was gone, and so she was left to her own devices for the moment. If one could call sitting perfectly still in silent agony devices, that is. The dizziness, constant sensation of her intestines squirming in protest inside her, weakness, and severe need to pee, were just the cherry on top. She wasn't exactly sure of why the monster, or perhaps just awakened dog, was helping her, but she couldn't deny that at the very least, a heavy weight had lifted off her chest. Immediate death wasn't hanging over her head anymore, and she was almost certain the beast would have eaten her by now if it was planning to do so. After a bit of struggling and maneuvering, and a fair amount of pain, she had managed to tie the bloody cloth around her head like an oversized bandana with a knot on the back of her head, covering all the important places she wanted covered like her ears, nostrils and mouth. And so she was left alone with her thoughts, which eventually turned to her oldest and best friend. Gods, she missed Catherine. Not for the servitude and convenience she brought forth as a dutiful maid, but as a friend. As an unflinching pillar of support and strength, covered in whip marks that Imhriel would spend long, sleepless nights treating. She wondered how she was doing now. She'd spent the majority of her personal wealth to buy Catherine her freedom after she'd disowned her family, so she wondered if she was at least living free and happy. She really hoped so. But as despair slowly fled away with her musings of easier times, and acceptance snuck to the forefront of her mind, she was left with the choice of continuing to hate herself and the world, inwardly rage at her dead teammates for being so irredeemably stupid, or at least try and struggle through her wrecked state and do something. And seeing as physical actions were out of the table, she was left with an old friend, a tool that was the object of frustration and wonder in equal measures throughout her relatively short life thus far. Mana. She inhaled deeply through the blood-covered cloth on her face, used to the smell by now, and started circulating the energy through her mana circuits, feeling the phantom veins running through her body flare to life. The mana responded willingly to her commands, as easy to command as a limb, albeit a weak one that she barely felt. From her navel, and out towards her legs. The connection between one's mana circuits and the body was not entirely a physical one. One couldn't cut open another humanoid and extract their circuits, as they were not a tangible thing without high-level magic being involved. But there was a connection regardless, and that academic statement only solidified in her mind as a fact when she felt her mana enter her broken legs. The circuits were malformed, shrunken. Off, in a sense. Usable, but in a way that would no doubt be more akin to forcing mana out, rather than excreting it with just a thought, which is what she was used to doing as an elf. Forcing mana out was more in the realm of humans, or any other races that didn't have attuned. Yet, there was little she could do about the state of her legs, so she focused on guiding and circling her mana, focusing entirely on the amount rather than the technique. Sometimes she'd excrete just a little bit of mana out of her palm, feeling it conform to the shape of the metal just an inch away from her skin, like a phantom sense of touch, but generally, she focused on simply forcing large quantities of mana out of the core in her navel, up to her usable hand, keeping it there, and then forcing it back down. If it weren't for attuned, the process would no doubt be multiple times as difficult and painful, but for the first time, that didn't bother her. She used to feel insecure all the time about her racial skill, wondering if every magical advancement she managed without a single resource was due to her own talent or because of the skill that made all elves like herself attuned to the world by nature. But when faced with her survival, that line of thought simply didn't register. Still, the harrowing experience of getting covered in rats and tossed down from a 9-story staircase did make her realize that up until she left her home, she was almost pampered, despite all the psychological torment her parents put her through. She may have never been allowed to touch a spellbook or read even basic magical theory before her parents were certain they had brainwashed her to be the perfect noble elf, something that had never come to pass, but never had she felt true pain before. Not quite like this. Maybe that line of thinking was productive. But it felt like it wasn't, and thus she discarded it, focusing on the flow of mana, the life force of the world, that little piece of starfire that ran through everyone's veins. It was a mindless task, but that was all right. She didn't particularly want to think, so she just continued. Mana, or arcane circuits as academic snobs referred to them as, were remarkably similar to a muscle. The more she strained them, the bigger they became, so long as she didn't strain them too much, too quickly, and tore them apart. Even so, simply to feel less helpless, she focused on power, on the amount, dancing on the thin line between just enough and too much. Maybe it was because she was already laying with one foot in the grave, or maybe it was because she just couldn't give a crap anymore, but she didn't follow her usual exercises and patterns. She wasn't calm nor rational enough to meditate and slowly work on her control, her efficiency. She was simply looking for power. Even if she only had 3 useless spells, she could at least force enough mana into them that each cast would be enough to defend herself with, if only for a second or two. Despite how uncomfortable the sensation was, she continued scrounging up bits of her mana, and forcing it from her navel, up to the exit point in her palm, before splitting the stream into the 5 smaller exit points of her fingers, the pressure mounting with each beat of her heart. She pushed it away with all her strength, yet kept the exit points firmly shut, even when the sensation became just shy of painful. Like clenching her lips shut while blowing with all her strength. And then she forced the mana back, and down. Her fingers suffered from the same issue that her legs had. Most creatures used mana circuits for their magic, which were connected to their physical self to some degree, and thus, the circuits of her fingers felt like moving mana through a pipe that was gnawed on, jagged and full of bumps. Yet that did little besides interrupt the smoothness of the flow, and she was not focusing on the flow whatsoever. In fact, she decided to push harder, grabbing trickles and drops of her mana and moving them out of her core to pool at her fingertips. Then she let her core generate more mana, until she was nearly full again, and she repeated the process, over and over and over and over and over and over again until her hand, from the tips of her fingers to her wrist, felt like it was about to explode. The mana no longer felt like the nigh imperceptible caress of a ghost phasing through her limbs. It felt like a physical force, like her blood was trying to force itself into the open air, her flesh an overstuffed balloon begging to pop, despite there being no tangible effect on her hand. The thought of casting, spark burst, with all the mana trapped in her hand tickled at her mind, but the gloriousness of that sight would be entirely lost on someone without eyes. Plus, the dog would probably not appreciate the racket. She added more, and she felt her circuit strain painfully, so she was forced to relax her mental blockade of the exit points, letting just a bit of mana bleed out of her palm and dissipate into the air. She felt the eye's gifts gather in the back of her mind like an errant thought she had stored to be turned over in her mind at a later date, likely some level-ups in mana manipulation, or whatnot, so she ignored them, keeping the exercise going, feeling her heart ease with every passing minute. If all she could do in terms of offense was to throw, spark burst, then she would make sure to pour enough mana into the spell to rend flesh from bone. Not that she was planning on attacking the canine, not unless it suddenly decided to eat her. But when blind and crippled, that added sense of safety was something she dearly craved. She let a bit more mana slowly drain out of her palm, making sure to keep the amount of mana trapped inside her hand at a constant, not increasing it nor lowering it. She didn't know if what she was doing was even a good thing. It might strain her circuits too much. It might give her mana fever. It might be doing next to nothing, or crushing her veins. The mana might even explode in her hand and make her an amputee, like the horror stories she was told of early mages trying to form magical theory. But if all that she had left was her magic, she might as well sacrifice a hand to experiment. Worst case scenario, she blew her hand up and died of blood loss. Not the worst way to go, not by a long shot. The temptation to release all that mana, concentrated into a haste spell just to see how it would feel like, was immense. And with impulsiveness born of having recently felt death's hand around her throat, she did exactly that. And her world exploded. She might have gotten a +5 in perception or a +20, she had no idea. What she did know was that she felt everything. Every individual hair on her body, every fold of skin, every single one of the dozens and dozens of different, faint scents she couldn't discern the name of. She felt the brush of the humid air on her skin like the caress of a hand, the air moving down her throat and into her lungs as she gasped, the faintest of vibrations in the metal underneath her body. She heard the muted, distorted whispers of conversation from gods knew how far away. But most importantly, she felt the immaterial little light in her chest that fed her core with mana. She felt said mana saturate itself in the essence of her soul and fill her circuits. She scrounged up as much of it as she could out of her abused core, and simply expelled it from her palm, directionless and meaningless. And she saw it, not with something as restrictive as her eyes, but with her mind. A colorless energy, more of a tactile sensation, washing over the iron planks to her left as they descended. It felt as if she was reaching forth with 1,001 half-numbed hands, caressing every inch of the things her mana washed over, the sensation growing fainter and fainter by the millisecond, until it disappeared entirely just 2 seconds later. She could only revel in the amazing sensation of feeling everything through a surge of mana, even if she had no more left to experiment with what high perception could do. But as all good things tend to do, haste eventually ended, the sensations abruptly fading, and she sighed in wistfulness, deciding to revisit her magical theory while her abused core recovered. The gestures for casting magic were made by excreting stable lines of mana in the air out of one's fingertips, and drawing 3-dimensional magic runes. And once someone knew or figured out how to cast a spell, the eye recognized it, and simplified the process, turning it into nothing but a thought that formed the spell and manifested it with mana. After spending most of her money to buy a book about the basics of magical theory, and then spending the rest and going a bit into debt so she could buy the Illumina and Haste spell books, she thought she understood magic enough to at least try and emulate what others did, and with enough knowledge in cancellation gestures to not blow herself up. Yet, after watching a street performer for 3 hours straight, she'd only managed a tiny burst of sparks, even with her natural magical talent. That had been both a sobering experience and a hard-learned lesson. So she had decided to practice. And it wasn't enough. Now, she had to work harder or die. Those were the only options she had. She formed the rune that gave her Spark Burst, then charged it with just the tiniest hint of mana before using the cancellation runes to dissipate the spell. If she ever got good enough at mana control, she might be able to just manually drag the mana out of the runes, but for now, she used the traditional way, like all regular mages did. The sound of steps nearing registered far too late in her over-focused mind, and she stiffened, feeling the light vibrations of the dog's paws hitting the metal just a couple steps above. Yet, it said nothing, did nothing, and thus she continued her exercise, trying not to be too sudden with her movements. Just reaching to its neck had made it extremely upset, and she had no idea if the beast had mana perception, so she made sure to move her mana slowly. The canine silently stood to her right, its calm, even breathing somehow soothing to her battered mind. As pathetic as it sounded, she couldn't help but latch onto its presence, an unbearable sense of loneliness leaving her starved for something or someone, anyone, to just be there. At least if the dog betrayed her measly, misplaced trust, it wouldn't do so with a friendly smile and honeyed lies. Animals and monsters were honest that way. Eventually, after an hour or two, the beast yawned, and retreated back up the steps, though not as far away from her as before, and with a scrape of its nails against the metal, settled down to sleep once more. She continued, uncaring of the headache pounding in her temple, the mindless task consuming her thoughts. At some point she fell asleep from exhaustion without even noticing, another disadvantage of her mind associating darkness with sleep. When she woke up, it was to the strange sounds of low howls and yips, odd hisses and chuffs, half the time sounding like the dog was trying to howl at the lowest volume possible and the other half sounding as if it had something stuck in its throat. Her mind eventually filtered out the noise, and she fell asleep again. The next time she woke up, it was to a paw tugging at the fabric on her face, and she brought her hand up to pull the fabric off her mouth, noting that the paw retreated the instant her hand moved. The dog remained as cautious as ever. With a feeling of utter dread of what was to come, she opened her mouth, her features contorted in disgust. A sickening ichor of copper poured into her mouth, a thin stream of the vile fluid coating her tongue and tonsils, before quickly petering out into trickle, then a slow drip. How did this look to any imaginary bystander? A canine of unknown proportions holding a bleeding rodent corpse over an injured human's open mouth. Were she in a philosophical mood, she might have imagined such a scene painted in a frame, some profound message hidden in its sprawls of paint. But all she could think about was the imagery of a baby bird being fed by its mother from one of her old childhood books, and a sudden bout of hysterical laughter rushed forth from some dormant corner of her mind. It strained and bubbled in her chest, and she could only barely manage to restrain it thanks to the liquid in her mouth, struggling not to move too much or choke. Her chest shook in silent laughter for almost the entire duration of her drink, and as soon as she swallowed and gagged down the horrendous slimy blood, she tugged the fabric back over her mouth, and clamped her hand over her mouth, tears running down her face and pooling in her sockets as she snickered, the pain barely registering. What was her pain resistance at now? A quick peek revealed it to have gone up to level 12. Why was that so funny? Maybe her body was just forcing her to relieve stress, or maybe she was just going insane. Either way, she couldn't help but find her predicament utterly hilarious. Truly the height of decadence, to be spoon-fed the lifeblood of our lessers without having to lift a single finger. Oh ho ho ho. She thought in the pompous voice of her mother, imagining herself doing that stupid fake laughter while dramatically fanning herself with that crystal-encrusted fan as the sounds of tearing flesh played in the background of her ridiculous imagination. Thanks. She forced out between choked snickers, more because of a sense of wanting to delude herself into some kind of twisted sense of normalcy, rather than anything else, struggling not to burst out laughing. Maybe a chuckle would do her some good, but she felt sick and as if she was about to puke her guts out, so she tried to contain it. This also did not feel like a situation where she should be laughing. At all. The sound of the dog eating the rodent next to her head suddenly went silent. The way aonk huss. The canine howled after a moment of silence, the sound transitioning into a creepy hiss towards the end, and her laughter stopped cold. That wasn't. Was she hallucinating? Thank you? She tried again, her voice wavering. Thwaonk hiu. It hissed in reply after a moment of silence, and she felt herself going rigid, any sense of humor completely vanishing as she felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. Was that what it was doing for all those hours? Trying to speak? It repeated its bastardized, spine-chilling mockery of the words thank you once more and she felt her teeth clatter and gnash together, her jaw trembling. It just sounded so wrong. Like something she'd hear whispered from the darkness in a horrid nightmare, and her overactive imagination did her no favors. Was this thing even a dog? What the fuck was she stuck with? Just because she saw some vaguely canine outline before she lost her footing back then didn't mean that it was a dog. Maybe some hyper-intelligent monster? A demon? Maybe a shapeshifter who took it too far and lost themselves? After a few seconds of shocked silence, a paw poked her in the side, and she flinched. Why yes. She eked out, her mind reeling. Was the beast so intelligent that it could understand her this entire time? Or was it just mimicking her as a way to mess around, pass its time? Or God forbid, was it trying to learn how to speak? Why? Assess? It hissed out like a snake, as if replying to her thoughts, and she tried to grit her teeth, only for them to slide all around each other, her jaw refusing to sit still. What the fuck was she supposed to do? She'd never even heard of a dog speaking with actual words, not even when some shady merchant was explaining to her mother why the little dog he was offering them was worth 600 gold crowns with a dozen different ridiculous, unrealistic promises. Any notion of this thing being a summon or animal of any kind was discarded. No, she was dealing with an intelligent, merciful beast. But what the hell was she supposed to do with that information? It didn't seem violent or angry with her, so that let her keep her wits and not outright panic, but she didn't feel that far off from doing just that. As stupid as the idea was, she decided to introduce herself, just like she was taught to do as a little nervous child scared of all the tall, well-dressed adults in the ballroom. With an unbearable slowness to the motion, she raised her shaking hand to point at herself. I am real. Ahem. Emrer, it growled, the first natural sound so far, then continued after a short pause. Ilial. It finished, the sound more of a whine than anything resembling speech, and she gulped, feeling like someone had dumped a stone to sit low in her stomach. After a few seconds where she mutely gathered her thoughts, a paw poked her again, and she jumped, pressing her lips together. Yes? She squeaked out, and the dog chuffed, before poking her in the side with its paw again. What? Coo. The monster replied, before growling in seeming frustration. Oh, it's looking for new words to mimic. That realization did absolutely nothing to reduce the churning of discomfort in her gut. The monster repeated its previous noise, struggling with the tea, and tried again. And again, and again, and again. All the while, she just tried to wrap her head around what kind of insane situation she'd found herself in. What? It finally said, popping the tea, and then, seemingly satisfied, chuffed and poked her in the side again. She was never religious, but as she tried to come up with a complicated word to keep it occupied, she started praying to any and all the deities she could remember to just send a rescue team already, and get her out of this bizarre hellscape she'd been dropped into. T couldn't say that its decision to learn about mana and human speech was all that thought out, but it was working fairly well. Its original plan was to learn human speech and then use it to ask questions to the human about how she uses the mana, but it realized quickly that such a thing was not going to be happening anytime soon. The human was also stunted because of her blindness, so even if she wanted to, it would be hard to ascribe meaning to the sounds she was teaching it. She couldn't exactly point at things she couldn't see. It was still good practice for when it found another human, or if it could find her again in the future so they could continue after her kin came. She had a unique scent, like all humans did, and despite it being buried under a couple layers of filth, after being around her for so long, it was difficult not to become familiar with it. It was an oddly fresh scent. Like air, cleaner than it had ever breathed, mixed with a myriad of sprinkles of different smells it had no description for. So, if she was nearby, it could probably track her down. Additionally, while it had thought that the language barrier would stump any and all progress with its understanding of mana, that had been far from the case. Simply watching her moving mana around was an interesting sight. It was difficult, extremely difficult, but after giving her another helping of rodent blood, at around the 4th day's mark, it managed to be able to sense her mana before it went outside of her body. And the way she moved it was extremely odd. It was very physical. The mana moved up and down her body, as if following the path of her bones, with the exception of the times it would just leak out of her palm. Its attempt to do the same was a complete failure. It simply couldn't grasp onto the mana. It was like air. It could direct it, push it out, but it couldn't grasp and move it with precision whatsoever. When it activated Echoes of Oblivion, it was a little easier to direct the mana, and as soon as it exited its body it automatically turned into the puffs of darkness. When it turned off the skill, the mana became both harder to move and direct, and seemed to do absolutely nothing, simply vanishing from its perception into the open air. At some point, it had decided to close its eyes, its head resting on its paws as it sat by the girl's side, messing around with its mana to the best of its ability. Which meant that it was struggling to do anything besides meaninglessly expel it. It just felt like it was missing something, and it didn't know what. Having grown both tired and annoyed at its lack of progress after another half-hour of doing this, it simply relaxed, emptying its mind of thoughts. It still kept a mild amount of attention aimed at the human's direction just in case she did something suspicious, as it hadn't forgotten about her attempt to sneak attack it. Resting on purpose just felt strange. Whenever it rested before, it was either because of need or because it couldn't do anything else. So the experience of just resting because it could and wanted to. It was extremely satisfying, fulfilling. It felt like a quantifiable improvement. Minutes passed, and eventually, it fell into a short nap, noting that mana perception had gone up to level 9, while mana manipulation had remained stuck at level 3. Which made sense, but that stagnation rather soured the taste of progression it had gained in its other skill. To its surprise, Echoes of Oblivion had gone up to level 2, which was nice, but only a tiny improvement in how easy it was to use. It did note something interesting, however. It could see through the inky mist, like looking through a glass with dark churning waters on the other side. It was a bit difficult to see properly, but it was more than possible. Which was a very convenient fix to the still-present problem of its glowing eyes. It couldn't cover itself with the darkness, nor properly keep it in place, but it could make the mist float above its snout and hide its eyes for a couple seconds at a time. Of course, the amount of mana it had inside itself was utterly pathetic, so it could only do so for a couple seconds before taking a break of another couple seconds to recuperate, a process that became increasingly slower the more the wolf did it within a short span of time. It peeked an eye open to stare at the human, feeling all the mana in her hand and comparing it to its own. It felt like comparing a pebble to a boulder. Frustrating. Mana was just frustrating. It had no particular issue with patience up until now, but after spending another hour trying and failing to get a proper grasp of its mana, it growled in agitation, and stomped its way down the stairs to release some frustration into a hapless rodent or two. She let out a guttural groan of relief once the beast walked out of hearing range. For a moment, she thought it was angry at her. But now that it was gone, this was as good a time as any to try. All the mana she had painstakingly gathered in her hand over the course of hours, forcefully extracted from her core until it was barren and dry, before repeating the process whenever it filled back up, was ready to be poured into a spell. She was near certain that she was hurting herself with what she was doing. If the searing agony in her hand wasn't enough of a clue, the feeling of her mana circuit straining and stretching like a thread about to snap, absolutely was. But she would take that risk, because she didn't want to spend a minute more in this loop of maddening absurdity she was stuck in. What came after she was outside of the pit was a towering problem that she was going to ignore until the time came when she could no longer do so. Stretching her hand above her head to feel for the railing, she trailed her fingers up the grimy iron to the top, and mentally tried to reconstruct the pit and the staircase's positioning, aiming her hand accordingly to send the spell in a direction where it wouldn't impact a wall. And with a mental thought and a strain of the mind where she shoved a veritable ocean of mana into the spell, a supercharged Illumina shot out of her hand like a white-colored flare. The feeling of her overstretched, abused circuits emptying themselves made her bite her lip until she tasted copper with a choked-out groan, simultaneously feeling like someone was punching needles through her flesh and bones and like someone was holding her hand over an open fire. After flexing her fingers a few times and realizing that no amount of physical stretching would get that pain to go away, she resigned herself to waiting for the sensation to pass, dropping her hand to lay limp by her side. Without having a connection to her, the Illumina spell would quickly burn out, but its blinding brightness should, at the very least, draw some attention. A bit of an empty hope, but it was all she had. Even if nobody cared enough to rescue her, which she expected, they should have come to fix the staircase by now. After having to endure the humiliating experience of having to piss herself, coupled with a pounding headache, hunger pangs, her squirming guts, what she assumed was a fever, and a feeling akin to someone having stuffed her head full of dry cotton, she felt like she was on the verge between sobbing and laughing, between choosing to struggle and giving up on the notion of help and just frying her brains with an overcharged spark burst, to just be done with it. It felt odd to admit, but the abomination's presence was something she craved at this point. She was still a bit scared of the beast, but it was the only form of life she'd been around for weeks that hadn't abused or hurt her in one way or another, her teammates included. Sure, the beast was the reason she'd lost her footing in the first place, but it was her teammates who'd sentenced her to death, something she inwardly knew from the moment the job had gone awry but was too panicked to properly recognize. The iron safety door was too heavy to be quickly lifted, and that was if their minder allowed them to open it in the first place, which was unlikely. Some bitter part of her wished that the beast hadn't granted her teammates the mercy of a quick death, and had let them get torn to shreds by the rodents like they deserved, but that wish felt like the entrance to a rabbit hole she didn't want to go down. What she really wanted was a warm, soft bed, and a hot bowl of soup. How many days had it been by now? Where the hell was everyone? Had they written her off as dead in the guild records? Such questions plagued her mind constantly whenever she wasn't practicing, but now that she was completely dry of mana, she had nothing to distract herself with. A dreadful doubt that maybe nobody would come to help kept creeping into her mind, and she struggled to keep the thought away from the forefront of her mind. An effort that was proving to be in vain, and thus she decided to open her system screen to distract herself. And she almost choked on her own spit when the system screen opened and a tide of words flooded her mind. You have progressed on your path. Infuser, level 7, level 8. Available attribute points, 1. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +0. Perception, +0. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +4. Soul, +2. Acquired skills. You have gained the skill, Mana Tank, level 1. You have gained the skill, Mana Conduit, level 1. You have gained the skill, Iron Stomach, level 1. You have gained the skill, Soul Perception, level 1. Dash, Poison Resistance, has leveled up. Level 4, level 7. Dash, Pain Resistance, has leveled up. Level 12, level 14. Dash, Illumina, has leveled up. Level 6, level 8. Dash, Spark Burst, has leveled up. Level 12, level 13. Dash, Haste, has leveled up. Level 9, level 10. Dash, Mana Perception, has leveled up. Level 15, level 16. Dash, Mana Manipulation, has leveled up. Level 9, level 11. Acquired traits. Blood Drinker, 1/2. You have sustained yourself on nothing but blood for multiple days, and have taken your first step towards the path of vampirism. Drinking the blood of others is more palatable and nutritious, and gives you a temporary boost to all attributes. Duration and attribute boost strength depends on the amount of blood you have consumed and its quality. She could only sit in stunned silence as she watched the system's updates scroll past her mind's eye. After an entire 20 years of living, she'd only gained a few skills she genuinely wanted, and the moment she turned her back on her family, she discarded all the ones she didn't want. To see such progress, so quickly, was not something she'd been expecting. Additionally, the skills were all things she'd never even heard of before. The system sometimes gave more or less information on skills for no seeming reason, and as she mentally questioned what each of them did, she only got any concrete information about Iron Stomach and Soul Perception, which were already rather self-explanatory names. She activated Mana Tank, and nothing happened. What? She murmured to herself, furrowing her eyebrows in confusion. Just to be sure, she deactivated and activated it again, noting that it was a sort of passive skill that could be toggled on and off rather than a skill that was used once and had a cooldown. Even after waiting a couple minutes, she noticed absolutely zero difference in anything, so she left the skill on and instead focused on her mana in preparation of checking her other skill. Mana Conduit activated with a thought, and she gasped in delighted surprise as she felt her soul pulse with power, feeding her core with mana at almost triple its normal speed. She started counting the seconds as they passed by, and noted that the skill stopped working after a flat 30 seconds. Then she started counting the seconds to see what its cooldown was, and after exactly 2 minutes, she felt it become available again. She activated it again, just to replenish her mana, even if she had absolutely no plans of abusing her circuits any more than she already had for the day, and decided to hold on to the attribute point she had for later since she couldn't decide on where to put it. With that out of the way, she read the Blood Drinker trait once more, and felt her breath stop. Not catch, nor hitch, she simply stopped breathing. Vampirism. Of course. How did I not think of that? She inwardly screamed as she reminded herself to keep breathing, feeling the nascent flutters of hope pick up in her chest while a tiny, hopeful smile curled her lips. Vampires could basically heal anything by drinking blood. Of course, there were severe drawbacks, moral and technical ones, as well as the path to becoming a vampire being a rather vague and secretive one, but the trait had given her both a clue and an idea. The Church of the Six-Eyed Crow. If any place in the dungeon hid a vampire within its halls, it would be that. Her recollections of her religious studies were a vague blurry mess, but she remembered that there was a strong connection with the church and vampirism, even if she didn't quite remember the reason. Vampires were extremely rare, extremely secretive and extremely withdrawn, so finding one to help her change would be really difficult, but if she just begged, offered whatever she had to the church and pleaded, did anything they asked of her, it wasn't too far-fetched to hope that they could put her in contact with a vampire who could turn her. And she would be able to fix herself. She knew that the drawbacks to becoming a vampire were as immense as the advantages, even if she didn't know what they were, but anything would be better than shambling from place to place, hoping that someone would be kind enough to give her their unwanted scrap to eat until she died of disease and exposure. With that crushing weight of uncertainty no longer sitting on her chest, she felt like she could breathe the putrid air just a bit easier. She had a plan, a concrete course of action to take when she got out of this godforsaken pit. If, a corner of her consciousness corrected, and the smile wilted away as quickly as it came. Right. Suddenly, she was wishing the beast would come back up already. There was just something so cathartic about violence. The amount of rats hovering and clambering up from the mounds of trash were even more numerous than they were before the incident with the staircase, so it had no shortage of food and entertainment, even if it continued being relatively cautious about the process. One tiny chuff, one scrape of a nail, and it would quickly bait whatever rodent had seen it into the shadow of the staircase, where it would promptly shred it apart, then stalk back towards the feasting vermin and repeat. It even decided to get a little more confident and creative, and had managed to make rat hunting an even easier task than it already was. Why would it exhaust itself by slamming the rodent around the floor, when it could simply throw the rat onto its side, rake its canines through basically any part of its body, and then walk back and watch it die without lifting a paw? Whether it was through the spine or the abdomen, it was all equally effective. Sure, it took a bit longer for a rodent to die when it was shuffling and dragging itself towards the wolf with its intestines trailing behind it, or twitching on the floor unable to get its limbs to work, rather than having its skull smashed into the floor once or twice, but the wolf didn't particularly care about how quick a kill was, only that it died. At least when it came to things other than humans. It wasn't like rats gave it pets and food every once in a while, so they could suffer, it didn't really care. Overall, it was a relaxing hunt, with a good haul of 7 whole rodents to consume and add to its stockpile, with one saved for the human. The blinding burst of white light that shot out of the pit, however, straight from where the wolf had left the human, was a less welcome sight than its pile of game, and it could only stare at it with a sense of indecision as it quickly faded out of existence. It wasn't going to stop the human from signaling for help, but it was tempted to. It felt like it was just on the cusp of understanding how the mana thing worked, and it doubted it could stumble onto an opportunity like this again. It decided that it was done pouring out its frustrations on the rats, so it quickly dragged the bodies up onto the first floor of the staircase one at a time, just to be out of sight from the hordes of squeaking vermin. It could eat while in sight of a threat, but it didn't particularly want to. After eating 7 of the rodents, it trotted back up the stairs to feed the human some blood again, the final rat dangling off its jaws. For some reason, the human reacted to the feeding with far less disgust than the previous times, and after eating the shredded remains of the rodent, it settled to sit by her side on its stomach, extending a paw to poke her in the side with a chuff. The human sighed, a tired sound. Discombobulate? It tilted its head, ears standing straight as it separated the sound into different, smaller parts in its mind. Yeah, that sound was going to be really hard. Maybe a bit too hard. It chuffed and poked her in the side again, hoping for a different one. God fucking damn it, she breathed out, and the wolf tilted its head. That one was doable. Yet when it started practicing, the human started making strange snorting sounds, which escalated into loud, rapid bark-yipping noises, her one functioning hand clenched around her convulsing stomach as she eventually started wheezing for breath. Even then, she continued making that weird sound, completely uncaring to her own oxygen needs. It growled in annoyance, poking her harder on the side of her waist to be quiet, but for some reason, that only made her wheeze harder and redouble her noises, so with a huff of annoyance, it got up and walked down the staircase to practice somewhere where it could actually hear the sounds its own mouth was making. Wait, no. I'm sorry, I won't laugh. See come back hack. She wheezed out behind the wolf as it walked around the bend, out of sight. What even was that cacophony supposed to convey? Some sort of happy bark yip sound? Why was the human happy over the wolf practicing human sounds all of a sudden, but when it first started she absolutely reeked of fear. Humans just didn't make any sense. The long walk down from his manor was no less harrowing on his psyche just because it was made through his own streets. His boots echoed across the grimy cobbles with the steady beat of a metronome, his back straight and eyes cold. Peasants, mercenaries, and adventurers alike took one glance in his direction and parted before him as if an invisible wedge took point before him wherever he went. As they should. Even with Miero's form tucked away in the shadow of his silver-embroidered trench coat, Kolak's stout frame by his side, his personally chosen best soldiers behind him, and every single protection he was able to come up with and place on his person, whether it be through enchantment, infusion, or artifact, the fact of the matter was that with every step, he got closer to entering the jaws of the dungeon, and he could only hope he would come back out whole. Streets narrowed, houses and stores faded, life petered out until all that remained were warehouses and automated factories. A fading soul dying by a drain, a gutter child shyly peeking through a broken window, a startled worker backing out of sight. On the other end of the third-floor substratum, the kingdom's teleporters would be admitting hopeful nobodies and experienced veterans alike to challenge the dungeon. But his turf was far from such clamors. And not all entrances to the dungeon lay in plain sight. His escorts were professionals, their steps light and quiet, to draw attention to his own thundering ones. Their visages faceless, every aspect of their stance and equipment formed and forged to accentuate his authority, his power. For all that it mattered. Across an alley, over a metal bridge that rattled under his heel, waste churning and bubbling under the arch down a staircase too tight for his soldiers to march through, instead forming a loose snake's spine behind his coattails, until finally, he turned the corner to see the entry point. A single brown piece of fabric nailed to the iron wall, under which lay a familiar tunnel of jagged metal, no doubt the work of months. And across the center of the covering, sprawled a blood-red gear, a single eye gazing coldly down at him from its center. He didn't know how they did it with naught but red paint and a messy brush, but that eye always looked down at whoever met its glare, no matter the position or angle. There was no magic, no real artistry, yet as he stared into the uncaring eye, he could swear the gear turned, just a single degree to the right. Even though it hadn't. It was both annoying and unnerving, much like the cultists themselves. Wordlessly, he extended an arm to Kolak, the man quickly placing a gas mask onto his glove. He strapped it around his head like a helmet, hearing all his soldiers mutely follow his lead with a shuffle of leather and fabric. After a moment to check that the purification runes and filter were functional, he clicked the button on the side of his mask to allow sound in and out. Kolak, take point. he ordered, his voice coming out in a tinny hiss. His guard did as he was told, one hand on his sword as he marched ahead, pulling the tarp aside and ducking his head to pass under the jagged shards of metal unharmed, the entrance just barely wide enough for a large man like him to pass through. He followed, knowing his itinerary was waiting for him. If the relative silence of the lowest rungs of the third floor was one born from absence of life, ahead lay a cacophony born from death. Light faded as the tunnel continued, the sounds vibrating the uneven metal underneath his feet. Hissing, clanging, the rattling of empty conveyor belts echoing throughout the smog-filled cavern like the clicking teeth of a monstrosity eagerly awaiting its prey. Kolak pushed aside another tarp on the other end of the tunnel, and held it open for him, moving to the side. Stepping out into the colossal cavern, he straightened once more, quickly checking his coat's enchantment again. After confirming his skin wouldn't burn and poison him from an unfortunate breeze, he fished in his pocket for the enchanted compass, and reluctantly dug it out, extending his hand just a bit to hold it horizontally in front of his stomach, his head bending down to stare. Burnished bronze met his eyes, the symbol of the machinists carved into its gently curving dome, and he flicked it open with his thumb, not wanting to see that eye for a moment more than necessary. Miero, Scout. The viscous black smoke nestled inside his coat swelled and gathered at his abdomen, the buttons on the front unlatching with surprising speed and dexterity. He suppressed a twitch of his brow as he watched the smoke burst out from the open gap of his coat like 1,000 ravens' feathers, clumps of darkness exploding with impatience to shoot off in 100 different directions. In less than a second, all signs of the kid's presence were gone. If he didn't have the ability to turn his muscles to steel in the fraction of a second, he would never trust him to casually nestle inside his clothes, but he had proven his merit thus far. 12 men and women stood stock still behind him as he simply waited, his hands in his coat pockets. 5 minutes later, a frenzied tide of shadows shot out from between every nook and crevice in sight, gathering like a whirlpool in front of him and coalescing into a thin, lean form in the span of a second. A blurry, wispy silhouette of black, with 2 white slits for eyes, glaring at him in a cold, angry impatience. 2 months of guard duty were far more grating to him than he'd expected they would be, but it was a necessary punishment. Breaking his bones just hadn't felt quite enough. Nothing. Miero dryly reported, his voice inflectionless, his featureless face unmoving. Keep a couple eyes out, just in case. Return. He simply said, and Miero wasted no time, turning back into a cloud of wispy black and shooting down to the ground under his coat, some parts of him breaking off to slither into the gloom to act as their eyes. Then the assassin nestled back into whatever nook and cranny he could fit himself into. He took the lead, hand loosely clutching the compass and checking it every few minutes. Traversing the bone pits, beyond some areas near the towers, was very difficult, even as one person. As a group of 15, the downwards crawl was unimaginably slow. After 3 or 4 hours of mutely traversing the labyrinth, they had to stop for a short break, to both recuperate their stamina and change their mask filters. It was a muted, subdued break, and they resumed shortly after. The descent was sometimes steep, sometimes dangerous, but most of all, lengthy. Another break, a longer one. Some light conversation was allowed as Miero scouted, the tight confines of the bone pits not allowing his soldiers to spread themselves thin, basically huddled around an open center. The lack of vigilance grated him. They were a bit too trusting of Miero. Something to fix later. Soon, they began moving again, their sights and surroundings slowly but surely becoming a little more familiar as they got closer to their destination. 8 hours of walking later, they came across what they were looking for. An iron gate, placed between 2 machines for seemingly no reason, blocked their path. Piles of wire were lying on the ground on either side, and painted crudely on the doors, was the symbol of the machinists. The detailed painting of the gear and the eye in the middle only further accentuated how unnerving the thing was. Now that they were getting into machinist territory, he put Kolak up front, regardless of their supposed cordial relationship. He just didn't trust them. After a long descent down uneven, and at some points, barely functional terrain, they were all exhausted however, so he ordered his men to rest up for an extra long break before they got to their destination, making his healers pump everyone up with a little bit of healing magic to clear up any soreness and snags that might be lingering, just a bit of energy to ensure they were at the top of their game. And eventually, the terrain flattened, the meaningless machines left behind by the dungeon growing a bit more organized was not the correct word. More utilitarian, perhaps. Factories and machines the size of his manor were scrapped and hollowed out to act as communal homes, their symbol painted everywhere with bright red and yellow paint. Piles of unusable scrap were stacked high and fused or melted together as if to form a grotesque wall of metal around the cult's little village of sorts, nestled under pipes larger than warships and in the shadow of a broken aqueduct. Yet, nothing moved. He walked his men down the catwalk flanked by 1,000 eerie eyes, coming upon a circular area that was the closest approximation to an open square that one could find in such a place, scarred and bent metal showing just how much modification they had to do to make a circular open space like this. In a place built by the dungeon, there was no cohesion, no plan, no logical shape. The factories were metal monstrosities more akin to someone grabbing 6 different shapes and mashing them together, before drafting random bits of machinery and open, dangerous equipment all over them, running 1,000 pipes around and through the structures, interspersed with windows and walkways as if to pretend the constructs of the bone pits were ever meant to hold life within their walls. Sometimes, the machines were just out in the open, connected to others, or sometimes just meaningless, things built just because the dungeon could build them. Like a child toying with its sandbox. He really disliked the bone pits. So despite the unsettling appearance of the cult's residence, and the countless drawings of gears with eyes sprawled across every flat surface, he couldn't deny that by comparison, this place was almost hospitable. In the center of the square he and his men were waiting on, was what he remembered to be the very lifeblood of this small community of freaks and nut jobs, a cylindrical tower 100 feet high, the side facing the entrance dedicated to water filtration, while the side facing their chapel, a metallic, crude imitation of Gothic architecture, was acting as a delivery system between them and their contacts on the 3rd floor, which included him. From the top of the tower rose a simple steel wire lift that vanished off into the darkness of the dungeon after just a couple 100 feet, no doubt changing directions dozens of times, until it reached another hole in the walls, where his men would load the carts with necessities and send them on their long journey down. The first time he'd found these folks, he'd felt like a country bumpkin, gawking at the absurdity of everything and everyone down here, but by now, the rush-hour aesthetic had grown on him. Another couple minutes passed in silence, and from around the cylinder, the person he'd been waiting for walked out. Archbishop Varmund. A man that made most men shit themselves at the mere sight of his true form, hidden under that bulky black robe. Frankly, he just found it fascinating, despite the initial surprise when he first saw him unfurl. He was like a brutalistic work of art. As he was right now, however, he barely came up to Monos's shoulder instead of towering over him at 10 feet tall, walking towards them with his back hunched and his metallic legs curled up against his chest, legs that tapered down to 2 round points of rubber like spiders' legs. A non-threatening, courteous demeanor, at least for now. As he grew near, the metallic hiss of his breath filled the respectful silence he and his men were maintaining. The bishop's head raised, his black hood hiding his facial features. A single, oversized golem's eye glowed with a sickly yellow light from under the murk of his hood, taking up almost 1/4 of his head, the lens squarely focused on him. "Welcome, Baron Manos Ironheart." Archbishop Varmund rumbled quietly, the sound gutturally deep and metallic, as if growled through a booming speaker on a low volume. His metal hands split his robe down the middle just a bit, and his metal fists came to meet in front of his chest, only the knuckles of the ring and pinky finger touching. Then, he unfurled his hands while rolling his wrists outward with the hiss of hydraulics, palm up, and bent his head down in a deep nod, his palms open as if offering something. He simply bowed in return, as deep as someone of his status could, within reason. A 45-degree angle. "Thank you, Archbishop. You seek audience with him." The bishop rumbled knowingly as they both came out of their greeting poses, and he nodded. For a man so fervently devout, he didn't beat around the bush, and he liked him for that exact reason. "There have been untoward developments on my part that he must know about. It pertains to our deal," he calmly said, and the bishop nodded. "Follow. You know the rules." The bishop warned, and he set his jaw, giving him a grim nod. The bishop turned, and began to walk deeper into the maze of distorted metal and broken stone. They followed. He could only hope the price of his failure wouldn't be too severe. They needed each other, so he was sure he wouldn't get killed. But its wrath would be hard to weather. He had no excuses for his failure. He'd simply grown complacent, assuming his information was always right. They moved down into unused air vents, rectangular tunnels of stagnant, humid air, then down even further through a dizzying labyrinth of steel pipes where their steps echoed into infinity, and eventually came upon a gargantuan staircase that led straight down into a pitch-black darkness, the steps slick with moss. As he followed the archbishop down, he felt the familiar sensation of a noose tightening around his throat. He'd done all he could. For 6 months, he'd been searching, but all he could find was fleeting, messy, and impossible to track. He couldn't find it, he couldn't catch it. It might be gone by now for all he knew. 16 people walked into the dungeon. 12 hours later, 3.5 came out. The wolf was starting to lose count of the days. Its internal clock was never the most accurate, and without access to the light crystals with their cycles, it wasn't exactly sure how much time had passed. It might have been the 5th day or the 7th, it just couldn't tell. Additionally, while its routine had become rather boring and repetitive by now, it didn't really have anything else to do, its only entertainment coming in the form of some recreational rat killing. It fed the human, moved its mana, tried to copy how the human moved hers to no avail, and slept as much as possible to accelerate its growth. Which was a very rapid one, because looking at itself now, it looked like any regular, decently fed canine, if a lot filthier. The sudden break in the monotony came in the form of an unexpected level up. Which wasn't all that unexpected in and of itself, but the question of what made it level up, was one that it realized it had no answer to. It had assumed that killing things was what made it level up, and it had been doing plenty of that, but between its current nap and its previous one, it hadn't killed anything, only practiced on using the Echoes of Oblivion skill. So practicing on its path-relevant skills also increased its level? Or was there some other hidden mechanic that it didn't know about? It hoped that humans knew more about the symbols than it did, because once again, all it could do was mentally dismiss those curiosities, throw the added attribute point onto intelligence, and hope that its questions would eventually be answered. Intelligence, +4. It took the time to focus on its body, touching things up a little bit. The scent receptors in its nose were an utterly mind-boggling number so high that it couldn't even count or imagine, but it decided to improve them anyway, experimentally doubling them onto one of the skill's phantom copies of itself, and after carefully confirming that there were no negative drawbacks to such a thing, applied it onto its real body. It healed any wear and tear of the miniature hairs in its cochlea, the organ behind the eardrum that allowed its brain to interpret the vibrations into sound, regenerated some of the torn-off micro-hairs on its antennae, got rid of some of the scar tissue on its snout and legs, and then hastily decided to double the length of its antennae. Having to glue its bottom jaw to the ground to sense vibrations properly was just too annoying, and added length wouldn't really have any negatives besides making the organ easier to snap and break, which would be an easy overnight fix. Finished with its physical upgrades, it slipped back into the embrace of restful awareness, and woke up with a yawn and a quick sniff. And then immediately sneezed, not at all prepared for the absurd amount of information that flooded into and around its mind, immediately shutting off stimuli to adjust. The human, who had gotten fairly comfortable around the wolf by this point, an observation of fragile interest, shifted. "Good morning," it muttered, and the wolf chuffed in acknowledgement to whatever it was she said, taking another deep sniff of the air. And sneezing again. It grumbled, awkwardly turning its leg and lowering its head to rub its nose with the back of its foreleg. After the phantom itch had receded, it put its paw back down, took a very slow breath through its nostrils and focused on the marvel of an overnight adjustment. And realized that it had probably gone a bit overboard by doubling what was essentially how effective its sense of smell was. It would tone it down a little when it napped again, at least until it got more points in intelligence. It wasn't quite an informational overload, but it was certainly difficult to focus on anything else but the insane, ludicrous amounts of subtle scents and aromas wafting into its olfactory receptors. It closed its eyes, and tried to identify as many as it could, snout to the sky. A spilled patch of grease a couple steps to its left, just above it. Weeks old. The almost spicy sour scent of rust coating the edges of the railing, mixing with the scent of uncorroded metal. The moss growing on the bottom of the staircase and piling onto some of the metal plates of the wall to either side of the pit. Rot, decay, death and blood from below. Half-melted plastic and the musky scent of some dusty building material from the trash pit, mixed in with the scent of various bits of food discard and various waste. The scent of blood coating both itself and the human was very interesting, a familiar iron smell undercut by a sort of gamey, pungent organic odor that differentiated it from regular metals. From the pipes running up and down the pit, the faint, faded smell of vile poison. From outside the pit, human food, alcohol, body waste, stomach acid, a dozen different minor chemicals. Then the scent of ammonia from where the girl had urinated on herself, layered over the unique scent of the human itself. That and 1,000 more scents it couldn't name nor recognize wafted into its nose with every breath. It felt like it didn't even need its eyes to navigate. It flared its newly extended antennae out, their length now long enough to go from the tip of its snout to just before its eyes. Even without reconstructing its environment from memory, it could navigate with relative ease. Scent allowed it to roughly feel direction and proximity, and vibrations helped with the finer details. Not that it was planning on giving up its eyes, that would be beyond wasteful. It was just an observation of interest. It quickly folded its antennae back into its snout fur, and opened its eyes, quickly sitting down and shuffling to lie on the steps. And it began to practice with mana again. Even if a small doubt in its mind lingered that maybe it was just wasting its time, all it took was one reminder of the visions it had seen when choosing whether to accept its path or not, and it faded, at least for a while. The symbols hadn't lied so far, so the problem was on the wolf's end. It was doing something wrong that was preventing it from succeeding. It felt like trying to grasp something with its jaws that was just close enough to have its teeth brush against it, but just far enough to be unable to take it. Routine continued, another dozen rodents killed, another couple bloody mouthfuls for the human, another nap that let it know that in just one more day or two, the tendons would be ready to stiffen and start functioning. A sharp gasp startled it out of its rest, and its head snapped up, instantly awake and aware, ears standing straight as it hurriedly swiveled its head around for threats. After a few tense moments of silence without seeing anything amiss, its ears drooped as it grumbled in annoyance, and settled back down to sleep. Sorry. I just dashed. The human started, and the wolf grumbled more forcefully, almost growling. The human got the message and went silent, so it shifted with a tiny chuff of gratitude and settled back to rest. It really wanted the new colors to appear already. The condition of her body prevented her from meaningful rest despite her exhaustion, and the beast constantly waking her up for new words to mimic was another factor that had stopped her from hoping for anything more than short naps. When awake, she would gently practice her remembered spells, followed by cancellation commands, making sure to never let her core become completely full with mana, something that everyone, mage or not, knew was a waste. But after a particularly lengthy nap that ended just moments ago, she'd come to realize why mana tank didn't appear to be doing anything. The skill was waiting until her core had been filled back up entirely so it could start draining it, never allowing it to remain completely full, pulling the excess bits of her mana into her circuits, inert and ready to be used. Her body was the mana tank, and her core was the battery. That realization was already uplifting, and then she realized the implications of what this skill was doing and could hardly believe what she was seeing. Mana constantly filling her circuits, automatically, meant many things. For starters, the flow of mana through her circuits would improve, the capacity would improve, the capacity of her core would improve, and if she took a long sleep with the skill at a high level, enough that her body would be stuffed full of mana by the time she woke up, she could technically have multiple times as much mana at her disposal than her core could store on its own. From what she knew, most low-level mages didn't store mana in their bodies because it required constant mental effort and attention to keep it in place, which most couldn't do, not until they got their intelligence high enough, and the rate of mana regeneration early on in one's career only made such a strategy viable if someone was expecting a fight hours ahead of time. And she just circumvented every single one of those problems. The only worry was if the skill would stop on its own, or just keep stuffing her circuits with mana until they burst. At the moment, however, the process was very slow, so the chance of that being an actual risk would only pop up if she spent a couple days unconscious. She suppressed her smile, reminding herself not to get too hopeful, reminding herself of all the various ways that tended to blow up in her face. Joy was quickly followed by despair as she'd come to know, so besides that explosion of mirth when she heard the abomination say "God fucking damn it" in its creepy, ear-grating voice, she would do her best to not become too hopeful. In the absence of positive emotions, the negative ones became all the more pronounced, so she simply suppressed them too, a resigned apathy slowly but surely taking hold of her as she shifted her mindset. She was still stuck in a pit. She was still blind and crippled. And she still had nobody. With an empty expression and an empty heart, she lifted her chewed-up fingers and continued practicing in silence. After waking up once more, and feeding the human her dose of blood, it decided to go for a different approach than usual to its mana practice. Instead of focusing on the mana itself, it focused on its source, its soul. Like an invisible, phantom limb that it could feel but at the same time not, it sat in its usual position, in the middle of its chest. The wolf expelled mana, watching the process with the unseeing eyes of its mind. The energy, the odd mist around its soul, gathered in the direction indicated, and its soul pushed it away with a mental order that was about as difficult as picking bits of gore out from between its teeth with a tongue that it could barely control. That was to say, very. But the mana complied, and simply wafted out from within its flesh to harmlessly float away and dissipate into the foul air of the pit. It repeated the process a couple times, then decided to try and visualize both the mana and its soul, just to see if it would help its mind with the process, and much to its surprise, it worked. Its imagination probably had left much to be desired, as it imagined the mana as some sort of oddly behaving yellow gas and its soul as a blue light crystal like the humans used, but it was seeing progress for the first time, and couldn't care less at the moment to refine or personalize the imaginary vision anymore. As the minutes rolled by and it tested its newfound ease of pushing out mana, it eventually stopped and let its mind frantically run through various possibilities, trying to figure out what it had been doing wrong. Even if it was easier to move mana around by visualizing the process in its mind, that still didn't help the wolf with figuring out how to properly use the Echoes of Oblivion skill, nor how to move mana the way the human did. It turned back to its mental image of its soul, ready to give up, but just a bit too stubborn to do so. Minutes, hours passed, its mind empty of thought but the singular desire to feel and understand. And eventually, for just a fraction of a second, a sensation as subtle as the brush of a hair alerted its mind to something below its soul. The sensation was a faint feeling of drainage. Like the feeling of its lifeblood leaking from an open wound, but painless, not an injury but a natural occurrence. Its curiosity and hope reignited, it tried to visualize that bleed, that sensation of its mana being sucked away into a place it couldn't perceive. It pictured its soul dripping a steady stream of mana into some place down below, some void. And it worked. The visualization in its mind came to life, the sensation quickly becoming easier and easier to feel the more it focused. There was a tether connected to its soul, leading down into something, slowly pumping mana into it. Since visualization had worked so well thus far, it tried to picture a bowl that caught the energy, and the barest awareness of something tickled at its mind. Then it imagined that its soul was feeding into some sort of vessel, a heart, perhaps. Remembering the organ in perfect detail and giving it the same blue coloration of its soul, it imagined that the tether led to such a heart. And it felt it. There was something that was tethered to its soul, a small thing, much smaller than the heart the wolf had imagined, but full of mana. And from it, just for a few finger widths, extended arteries and veins, before the feeling faded. This unbeating heart of mana tethered to its soul was small, but with much more capacity than its soul. It experimentally drew from it, and pushed the mana towards the phantom arteries, feeling with wonder how the energy moved along lines within its body that didn't physically exist, as if painting veins along the way while it traveled. The wolf had a vascular system but for mana, this entire time. And it hadn't even realized. It didn't know whether to be angry or incredulous. Grabbing hold of the energy in its phantom heart, it pushed it outwards in all directions again, yet unlike when it used its soul, the mana followed its mana veins, rather than just going straight through its flesh. It was a very strange sensation to feel something in its body, but knowing that it wasn't actually there. From its chest where its mana heart lay, one large vein went down its spine and out of its tail. On the other side another equally large vein followed its spine upwards until it was about to enter the skull, then diverged down to fade out of its mouth. Four other veins, slightly smaller, moved down through its limbs, fading off to nothing at its paws. A direct command for the mana to leave through its flesh proved extremely difficult, its veins growing smaller veins to try and lead the mana out of the middle of its spine, an endeavor it quickly gave up on. It got up from its lying position, and activated Echoes of Oblivion, using the mana in its phantom heart rather than its soul, just to see if anything had changed. The results were instant. It yelled as its legs crumpled, barely managing to right its limbs, almost tumbling straight onto the human's injured legs, who let out an exclamation of surprise at the sudden sound. With shaking legs, it lowered itself onto its side with a shiver, and grit its jaws shut with a growl as it weathered through the sensation of its mana forcibly making a billion tiny little mana veins across every hair's width of space in its body. It was the worst sensation it had ever felt. A sensation of such supreme discomfort it was borderline painful, but somehow worse than any pain, making its legs shaky, its stomach clench, its arteries wriggle under its skin. It felt like an uncountable amount of burrowing worms moving through its flesh after it had deprived itself of its sense of pain, feeling the uneven lines move through its flesh. It panted, and growled in agitation, tilting its head and biting into the iron plank it was resting on, the pain of its tearing gums helping it ground itself, the shriek of tearing iron a comfort in the storm of unease. It jerked its head around, the metal being shredded and spit out of its bleeding mouth, the wolf having just enough presence of mind to not bite too deep and sever the plank. It turned its discomfort to anger and its anger into pain and catharsis, drowning out the sensation. Then murky blackness covered its eyes, its mana finally breaking through its fur after saturating every tiny bit of its body, and the sensation disappeared like it was never even there. It froze, unlatching its teeth from the metal, and got up, tilting its head down to look at its paws. A black void, in the rough, wispy shape of a canine foot. Its tail started wagging, hesitantly at first but quickly growing to a furious whirl of motion, the canine in complete and utter disbelief and elation. It reared back on its hind legs, lifting its upper body clean off, and purposefully stomped with its full power and body weight down onto the iron. Nothing. It chuffed, growled, barked, howled, ran up and down the steps, all in complete and utter silence. Unable to contain itself in its pure glee, it turned off the skill, turned its head up, and did something instinctual that it had never done before. Gathering as much air into its lungs as it could, it howled in celebration with all its might. Then, just because it felt like that wasn't enough to express its feelings, it moved mana down the phantom veins that went through its lungs and out of its throat, pouring its intent to share triumph into the howl, the joy of victory. The howl quickly grew to be almost twice as loud, the mana intertwining with the sound waves, carrying its joy to all who would hear. After a few seconds, it ran out of both mana and air, and panted in joy with its tongue hanging out of its mouth, not letting the human's surprise and fear sour its mood as it quickly trotted down to kill some rodents in celebration. Then it remembered that its mouth was bleeding and quickly sat down for a nap to fix that. 30 minutes later, it got up again, and went to enjoy itself with the squeaking vermin. It feasted, brought up one for the human, who was strangely enough, almost eager to drink now, then let the skinned corpse sit next to her, just in case she wanted it, and went to sleep. Acquired skills. You have gained the skill, Logotexnia, level 1. Mana manipulation, has leveled up. Level 3 level 4. Echoes of Oblivion, has leveled up. Level 2 level 3. Although immensely pleased, borderline ecstatic over its progress, the new skill was what drew most of its attention. Logotexnia was a rather odd skill, according to the symbols. It was basically about controlling the sounds it made using its mana. It could muffle things, make them louder, or even alter them to be entirely different. It could let it pour feelings into the sound, intent. Its range of application was just absurd. As long as the sound originated from the wolf, it could twist it into whatever it wanted, and the ability to use feelings and intent was one that transcended all language barriers. Immediately, its thoughts moved to its ongoing attempt of human speech, and it decided to try using the skill on that, as soon as possible. There was little in the way of information explaining how the skill worked beyond some vague notion of willpower and understanding, but it would make it work, just like Echoes of Oblivion. Eventually, the scent of cooked rat and the sensation of the girl's mana being expelled, coupled with the sound of her spark spell, confirmed that she was most likely eating the rodent it had left her, so it continued its sleep unperturbed, mentally signing off the racket as nothing to be concerned over. But maybe it was getting a bit too comfortable with having the human around. And that thought gained a lot of merit when it woke up to the feeling of something faintly brushing against its leg. Its eyes snapped open to see a dainty human paw faintly brushing against its foreleg, the fingertips hesitantly brushing over its fur, and it tensed. It had laid down on her left side this time without giving it much thought, as the step above her was mutilated by its jaws a few hours ago. The human felt the sudden tenseness of its muscles, and momentarily paused, but then continued on regardless, her fingertips faintly brushing over its nails, which it barely remembered to mentally blunt in time, and forelegs as it watched her, unblinking. Eventually, it relaxed, and the human grew a bit more confident in her movements. Honestly, it felt nice. It was tempted to offer its head for some good pets, but it did not want her fire-spewing hand anywhere close to its vitals. Some instinctual part of itself just didn't like fire. Sure, it had grown used to her, and had even grown to like her quite a bit, as it had never spent such a prolonged period of time around a single particular creature, but it wasn't forgetting that sneak attack attempt, not anytime soon. Not out of some grudge, just as a reminder that the human could, and maybe would grab an opportunity to hurt it, even if the wolf was helping her. No mana entered her hand however, so it shuffled a bit to the side, thankful for how wide the planks of iron were, extending its legs towards her left flank for better access. Her fingers gently curled around its paw and rubbed at the soft bits underneath, which felt divine. Its tail started thumping against the iron, just a bit. "You're so small." The girl breathed out with an odd sense of awe? Confusion? It couldn't tell. An hour went by in what felt like a minute, and it eventually decided to try using its new skill as the human needed its paw. And much to its surprise, using it was incredibly easy. It had been expecting a complete and utter slog of hard work and practice, but all it had to do to make the skill change the sounds coming out of its throat was roughly know how they were made, and mentally order it to change the sound wave to what it wanted it to be. The rattle of metal, that blasted P sound it couldn't ever properly do because of its lack of cheeks. As long as it understood how a sound was made, it could replicate it with relative ease. The knowledge of how sound waves worked proved utterly invaluable. Sure, it required mana, and a lot more focus than making human noises the normal way, but as soon as its mental acuity was higher, either through modification or simply dumping points into intelligence, it was sure that it could just growl, or some equally simple sound, and twist it 100 different ways to form whatever sound it wanted, while doing other activities. And it wouldn't even have to modify itself. It wouldn't say that it was through luck that it got the skill, more of an accident, really, but the circumstances lining up the way they did, from its knowledge of what sound waves were, allowing it to understand and better use the skill, to getting said skill right when it was starting to give up on making some human noises like P or a sharp B. It felt great. It was used to circumstances lining up in the worst way possible, so this break in the pattern was more than welcome. It still needed some practice with using the skill, but after an hour or so of making human sounds with surprising accuracy, it felt like it could make most simple sounds. So with intense focus, it poked the human on the side, and let out the sound it had practiced the most. "Thank you." It held lowly, the skill twisting the sound waves into something more intelligible to the human, pouring a bit of extra mana to convey a sense of curiosity through the sound, and the human stilled, the scent of fear entering the wolf's oversensitive nostrils. She gulped and resumed her previous activities after another moment of tension. "Why yeah, no problem. Even if you probably don't know what thank you or no problem means." The human whispered back, a long, complicated series of sounds that it was neither going to attempt to interpret nor mimic. It chuffed and poked her again, and the human sighed. Discombobulate? Thankfully, she understood what it was asking for. The wolf considered it for a moment, then decided to try it this time, fairly confident it could make whatever sound the human threw at it, as long as it didn't run out of mana. As they relaxed side by side, the human petting its legs while it pestered her for words to try out with its new skill, it felt relaxed, comfortable. Even the constant, barely perceptible hunger from the devourer skill faded as they continued, until they both fell asleep. Their rest didn't last long, however, as the gears below began to spin, and the most horrific, vile poison it had ever smelled suddenly entered its nostrils, making its eyes fly wide open. The beast's rate of progression with speech was ridiculous. Maybe it was 5, maybe it was 15 days, but even if she took the higher end of that estimate, learning to speak so quickly and legibly in such a time frame was an absurd feat for something that was decidedly not human, and most likely less intelligent than one as well. She hesitated to call it a dog, because while its legs and paws felt like a dog's, it was much, much too smart, and that was without considering its strength comparative to its size, as well as the fact it had some skill for tearing apart iron. Whether it was a dog or not, however, she could think of at least 4 scientific institutions and noble families each that would be losing their minds just to get their hands on the beast. As for her, she was just hoping it would stop talking already. Understandable or not, the sound was horrendous. It made her skin crawl and her eardrums squirm inside her ears. It had, very suddenly, improved in its ongoing attempt at human speech, but that didn't make its voice any better. It was a concoction of growls, quiet howls, grunts and whines, mashed together and twisted to form words, and she would rather glue her ear to a loudspeaker as it broadcasted someone scraping their nails against a chalkboard than listen to it speak for any prolonged period of time. At least at first. Much like she'd grown used to the pain, she eventually got used to the horrific mimicry of human speech, and it was a lot less terrifying to listen to when she held its paw in her hand, the beast no longer some unknown entity but a small, albeit extremely disturbing, creature. Hopefully of a canine build. She'd even managed to make it fall asleep eventually, and soon followed suit. When she'd woken up and started practicing, she had to stop in puzzlement as she felt a surge of mana nearing her location, hurriedly using cancellation commands as her heart started slamming into her ribs. For her to feel that mana from the other side of the pit, whatever was coming was big. Some field effect? Or poison cleanup, for when the rats were too many to clear with mercenaries and adventurers for a reasonable price. The realization was almost disbelieving, a faint feeling of betrayal nestling in her heart. Did they even send someone to check for survivors? Did they do so and then decide to kill her anyway? She was going to die, trapped in a metaphorical box and gassed like a rat. Everything she'd been through, all that training, 20 years of living, just for that. Fuck. She half laughed, half sobbed out, her breath stuttered and her chest quivering from nerves, her mind and body unable to pick between sobbing or laughing hysterically, her body trying to switch between them with each stuttered, tiny breath as she suppressed it. With a hurried, panicked train of thought, she tried to come up with alternatives that didn't make her fear a slow agonizing death, but her mind remained stubbornly attached to reality, telling her insistently that there was hardly anything else that would feel like that. She didn't get the chance to further attempt to delude herself before a pair of canines chomped through her torn garment, somehow not chewing into her flesh, and then dragged her down the stairs with haste she hadn't been expecting, letting out a short cry of anguish as her broken legs slammed into each step with loud clangs of metal. Gritting her teeth with an agonized gurgle, she jerkily lifted her hand up to the beast's neck, and before it could pull away this time, she used a mildly overcharged, haste, spell on the beast. After a single second where it froze in surprise, it continued, practically flying down the stairs. Through her panic, she only barely managed to open her system screen and put her spare attribute point into endurance in the hopes that she wouldn't come out of this without legs, feeling her broken bones grind against each other inside her flesh, nothing but the snug fit of her iron greaves and thick pants preventing her bones from splintering out of place. The most horrific, vile poison it had ever smelled suddenly entered its nostrils, making its eyes fly wide open. Its nails scraped loudly against the iron as it hurriedly jumped to its feet, struck with a sudden bout of panic and indecision. The scent was overpowering. And it was getting closer, fast. It dashed to the railing, ignoring the strange sounds of the human, and tilted its head to look up. It flared its antennae, aimed its ears to funnel the sound into its eardrums, and took a deep sniff, just to confirm what it dreaded. It quickly located where the scent and the extremely faint sense of mana was coming from, for relatively thin pipes that were bolted to the corners of the pit. Its eyes trailed up along the pipes, until its head was tilted upwards, where the pipes curled inwards along the top rim, snugly fit under the metal walkways above, where the humans would hook their trash carriers. Along the cube-shaped frame of the pipes were spots where rectangular metal blocks extended, pointing down, covered in small circular holes. A design it had seen many times before, one that was definitely designed to spray out some form of gas or smoke. And not all gases floated up, many floated down. Understanding of what was happening was swift and decisive. The humans were going to wipe the pit clean, using poison, and it was poison that neither itself nor the human could survive. Maybe the scent was much worse than how strong the poison itself was, but if it wasn't, it was much worse than almost anything it had run into so far. This was poison made to kill, not a byproduct of the human machinery. So it had to leave, now. Tilting its head down, however, presented it with another problem. The spinning gears were crunching away at the several feet tall pile of trash above them, and that made any and all rats that were occupying the pile rush up to the surface, likely done on purpose by whoever was controlling everything. Just from a cursory, rushed head count, it could see at least as many rats as it had killed with the staircase, with more rushing out of the slowly lowering mound of trash, climbing along the ridges and squeezing out of the grates one after the other. There were hundreds of them. It was, once again, completely stuck. If it took one step down there right now, all it would take would be a single rat to alert a small horde of its kin to tear the wolf apart. But the only way to escape the poison was to go down, ride the trash, hope it didn't lose its footing and get crushed, and manage to scramble to a pipe large enough to squeeze into. The topmost row of gears had a gap of about a human's height, and the rows tightened in increments of about a foot from what it remembered. So while difficult, it could probably survive all the way down as long as it kept its footing and its body in the middle of the gap. However, all it had sensed underneath the gears when it had been sniffing around with its antennae was a gigantic nothing. The drop below could be 20 feet or 200, it had no way of knowing right now. Additionally, the human. It wasn't sure of how it would save her. It certainly had the strength to do so, as its new tendons finally finished during its most recent nap, not a moment too soon, but saving her would be difficult regardless. It needed more time to think. Tilting its head towards the pipes, it saw the first wisps of the poison puff out in a steady stream that lazily floated downwards, blotting out the human nest's innards 1 inch at a time. It turned, bit into the human's garment while making sure its teeth were blunt to her skin, then hurriedly dragged her down the steps, ignoring her exclamations of pain, hoping to take her down to the second floor to buy just a bit more time to think of a viable plan of escape, if not for both of them, at least for itself. Halfway to the second floor, her hand raised to its neck in a familiar manner, but it was too distracted to react in time, only managing to freeze as her fingers tapped its fur. Her mana did something, and suddenly the world was far more vivid, far more slow. Whatever she did was only beneficial, so it didn't bother wondering, simply resuming its hurried pace. After positioning her body sideways on one of the steps on the second floor, it unlatched its teeth and peeked through the bottom gap of the railing at the rats. From what it remembered, their scent receptors were much lesser than its own, but far more than a human's. So they would eventually smell the poison, likely soon, and hurriedly throw themselves into the pit, assuming nothing alive caught their attention. It didn't have much time to test its newfound strength, nor did it know its limits at the moment, but it did not want to let the human die. Getting another one would be an utter pain, especially a blind one that it could easily isolate and spend time with. If it could save the human without sacrificing its own survival, it was going to do so. Even while its eyes were flickering back and forth from the rodents to the steady stream of poison hiding the innards of the human nest above them, it could faintly feel where the human was, a curious feeling it didn't care to question at the moment. A plan quickly began to form. A mildly risky one, but the only one it could come up with that would make both itself and the human survive the coming ordeal. Speaking of the human, it was starting to hyperventilate behind it, so the wolf chuffed as low as possible, snout turned towards her. "Oh, I thought you left," it whispered, barely audible even to its own ears. She sounded relieved, and her breathing slowed a little, so it chuffed low again, before prowling down the stairs, gleaming gold orbs focused on the vermin littering the pit floor. It just needed to get its antennae to touch the stone. The vibrations didn't travel well between different materials, all it could sense when feeling the metal staircase were a couple feet of stone, and the entire staircase itself. Slowly, it activated Echoes of Oblivion, trying to restrict the skill to only cover its eyes to conserve mana, to middling success. With its head as a wispy effigy of darkness, it flared its antennae, and extended its snout down to the stone at the last step of the staircase. And it quickly realized that this might become the most bitter fight for survival it had to date. The rats in the pipes were everywhere. No matter what pipe it picked to scramble onto, there would be rodents waiting to pick its bones clean. They were even more numerous than during the staircase incident. The constant vibrations of the gears provided it with a mental image that was extremely detailed, even if the perception bonus it had gotten from the human skill faded, so it quickly located the single best pipe in the interweaving network underneath, one just big enough for the human and itself to fit into and maneuver, with only a few rats scurrying about inside. Likely because of the thick iron grate that prevented the rodents from fleeing, but that wouldn't be a problem for the wolf. It tilted its head up. The poison was almost halfway down the pit. It needed to wait just a little bit more. It covered its legs in silent darkness as it dissipated the mist around its head and quickly scrambled up to the human, chuffing again to notify her of its presence. She murmured something the wolf didn't pay attention to, her breath still rough and stuttered from the pain. Nothing the wolf could do about that, she'd just have to endure. The relative silence felt suffocating as the seconds rolled by, its eyes nailed to the horde. As the poisonous cloud descended to just after the middle point, a few rats started sniffing the air and looking up, squeaking in alarm and becoming more animated, as if unsure of what to do. The alarm squeaks that signified danger multiplied quickly, and soon enough, most of the rats on the surface were scrambling into the tiny grates at the edges of the pits, those that could fit. The rats scrambling up from the shifting, rumbling mounds of trash caught up quickly and started trying to burrow downwards to the pipes, snaking between bits of discarded metal, many of them quickly getting crushed by the gears. The gas was now 2/3 of the way down, and every sniff of the poison made its nose protest as if doused in acid, despite the amount of particles it was inhaling only being the absolute minimum for any scent to even register for most creatures it knew of. That stuff was probably strong enough to melt the human, never mind just killing her. Some rodents squeezed into the metal guides on the side of the pit's walls to make their way down to the pipes below for more safety. Most of the bigger ones however simply jumped off to burrow into the trash and get crushed. Truly stupid creatures, waiting on top was the only way to survive. The garbage heaps were steadily lowering, and the wolf quickly regarded the falling poison, and the speed at which the mounds of trash were lowering, and they had a chance. A fairly slim one, but it was there. It bent down to bite onto the human's garment again, tilting its head to check up on the cloud of gas and the rodents. Twice as strong as yesterday with its new tendons in full function, it didn't need blood rush to drag the human, so it saved the skill for later, and dragged her down, slowly, making sure not to be sudden and have the human make some loud sound of pain that would attract the rodents before the wolf was ready. Its heart hammered in its chest, devourer, whispered in its ears, begging for a feast, for action, and adrenaline ran thick in its blood like glue. Its body was almost shivering from the wild mix of dread and anticipation, but it refrained from any hasty actions, for the moment. Dragging the human off the last step of the staircase with a light rattle until her shoulder was parallel to its own, it spent a moment to fix its grip, and with its head sideways, prepared itself for yet another close brush with death. The smell of the poison was overpowering. The rodents covered the sides of the pit like an undulating blanket of filth as they scrambled to find some random pipe to escape into, dozens of them slipping off or being pushed off onto the retreating mounds of trash below, and the ones that were impatient simply jumped off on their own to try their luck with the gears. It raised a hind leg to tap the human's left wrist, a short grumble rumbling out of its chest, a wordless request. Her hand raised to hesitantly tap its hip, yet no skill infused its limbs, the motion almost like a question of its own. It tapped her again with a growl, and the human made some short sound of realization, before tapping its leg once more, and the wolf felt the world become brighter, more colorful, slower, louder and more tactile, every minute shift of its body increasing in speed it wasn't expecting. While the previous boost felt like its body became lighter, this one felt like its body was utterly weightless, the feeling twice as potent. The human started coughing, finally able to smell the poison, presumably. The metaphorical clock was ticking, and the wolf realized that it couldn't wait any longer. There were only about 12 feet of air between them and the poison cloud. A blanket of death blotted out all light as it descended, and in the darkness, two gleaming golden eyes narrowed as the wolf bent its legs in a crouch, its body pointed straight at the pit with its head wrenched to the side, canines tightly holding onto its human charge. It started slow, just to not dislocate the human's shoulder, and quickly sped up within 3 bounds, thankful that the absolutely deafening clamor of the trash pit was covering the sound of the human's pain and discomfort, as well as the scrape of her foot coverings against the stone. Despite the awkwardness of running while hauling a heavy human at its side, destroying its balance, the girl's skill made it so blindingly fast that it didn't matter. The panic and the deafening racket of breaking and bending materials covered for their charge perfectly, the rodents only turning to notice them when they were 10 or so feet behind them. Far too late to stop their charge. One shrill squeak prompted another, in a chain reaction that took less than a second as they quickly abandoned any notion of self-preservation, charging at them mindlessly. Blood rush activated, and the wolf's eyes bulged, the bonuses in perception, speed, strength and endurance all combining into an incredible feeling of absolute power. The world slowed to a crawl, and the wolf sped to a blur. It could feel every vein pulsing under its skin, every individual hair tugging back from the wind, could individually count how many rats there were in and around the pit from a mixture of hypersensitive vibrations, the sounds of their breaths, the scents wafting into its nostrils. Its sight sharpened, and it could probably individually count each hair on the rodent's hides. Not that it needed sight. Every sound wave brushed the microscopic hairs of its antennae, every vibration of its paws smacking into the stone moved through its muscles and bones to rattle the base of the organ, feeding the antennae information without any actual touch. It could run through the human's nest with its eyes and ears shut if it wanted. It felt, in one word, amazing. Lowering its center of gravity, it pushed its limbs to the limit, and just before it collided with the semicircle of rats rushing at them, used its lower body like a whip, kicking forward with its back legs before curling them up to the side of its stomach while its forelegs turned to the left and dug into the stone to add to its momentum, its nails acting like razor hooks to stab into the stone. Its right side, hip and legs, smashed into the rats, and its speed and power allowed it to weather the hit with nothing more than the dull ache of a bruise as half the rats went flying into the pit, and before its momentum could bleed off completely, it slammed its back legs onto the stone and pushed away, digging its nails into the ground, and yanked the human away just as the remaining rodents to their right were about to leap onto her, adding almost 3 feet of distance. Just half a foot away from the lip of the pit now, it was relieved to see the human using that fire skill to blow the rat's back for a moment, buying the wolf the moment it needed. It forcibly tugged the human away again, just enough to get itself into the right position. Its lower legs moved back, and met air before curling in to press against the wall, the wolf's lower body hanging over the trash pit. The human suddenly jerked with a guttural battle cry and blasted the rodents again, the scent of burnt fur and fabric momentarily cutting through the poisonous miasma in its nostrils. That sudden movement, however, caused the abused fabric its teeth were clamped around to tear apart, the wolf barely managing to hook its forelegs' nails into the stone to delay its fall by a second as it jerked back, its elbows digging into the sharp corner of the pit. The tiny scraps of fabric its jaws were holding onto were the only thing keeping it suspended, and those were quickly tearing. A flash of panic chilled its gut, and it swung its head onto the human's right shoulder, only to remember a moment too late that the right side was ripped too. With its nails sliding out of their stony sheath, there was no time to think of an alternative. It bit down on her collar, barely managing not to sever an artery in its panicked chomp, and dragged its forelegs down to brace against the wall, curling all four of its legs under its chest. It had been expecting a blast of fire to the face, but besides some short yip of surprise, she didn't react, still blindly shooting sparks out at the rodents. With a growl of exertion, it pushed with its legs as hard as it could while wrenching its head back, throwing the girl backwards into the trash pit. She screamed as she was launched over the wolf, a sound that was somehow still only barely audible past the cacophony filling the pit. It opened its jaws and let go of her collar to let her tumble off into the trash pit, a movement that it followed, with much less momentum. For all the power the boost gave it, it only managed to flail midair enough for it to land in a diagonal with its legs extended, the impact of a 20-foot drop not nearly as painful as the dozen sharp metal edges and bits of glass that slammed into its hip and then its side, bruising its bones and tearing its skin as it sank into the fragile waste with the sound of 1,001 things breaking underfoot. Mid-air, it managed to catch a glimpse of the human landing legs first on some of the softer bags of trash, a small mercy. It scrambled to its feet and extended its neck. Its head peeked over a thin sheet of sharp metal and rested upon her squirming, sobbing and groaning figure. Groaning and sobbing was good, it meant she was alive and conscious. Letting out a loud bark to be heard over the cacophony, it rushed forth to the lip of its crater and kicked once, twice, allowing its nails to partially cut into trash for a better grip, and quickly scrambled out, battering and kicking rodents out of its path as it moved to her side. After a few stumbling steps, it half hovered above her, quickly checking her for any urgent wounds, which it found none of. Then it lifted its head to swivel around and keep an eye on the rodents for what little time it had to spare. It hadn't been expecting the fabric to tear, for some reason. It should have seen that coming. Despite that hurdle, however, they were right where they should be, on the top and right in the middle between two rows of spinning gears, even if it had to shift its footing every other second to not lose its balance. They just had to hold their ground until the pipe revealed itself. It growled, an almost instinctual sound that served no real purpose as it watched a couple dozen rats jumping off their perches on the surrounding walls to charge at them. Even if most of them were not paying attention or just didn't hear them over the deafening racket of the gears. Some landed badly and got injured, some fell through the cracks and down into a cage of metal trash and got lost, buying them precious time, but most of the rodents landed perfectly fine, blazing a maddened line straight towards them. A chorus of shrill squeaks from behind made it turn its gaze back to the wall they just jumped off of, and its eyes narrowed while its lips curled into a snarl at the sight of more than 100 rodents. The vast majority of them now jumping out of their pipes and metal indents into a messy pile of filth just a few feet away. Maybe it should have done something differently. Maybe there was just some option it hadn't considered whatsoever. But there was no time to ruminate on such thoughts, nor gain its bearings. This was the best it could come up with. It chuffed to the whimpering human, moving a hind leg to poke her in the back, lowering its body in preparation. Phew, wuck. She sob-groaned out between grit teeth. You piece of, fnuff nun psycho. She grunted, lifting her upper body off the unstable ground with one arm, to flip over onto her back, panting. Damn it, she groaned out, her left hand reaching out to clutch its leg in a tight, desperate grip. They were surrounded by vermin, but the vast majority of them were coming from the wall 15 feet away, something the wolf was going to deal with, and hope the human wouldn't panic and throw sparks at its back. She would just have to deal with whatever rodents were behind them. Its eyes swept over the shifting terrain one more time, forcefully shaking off her hand with a jerk of its leg, knowing it had mere seconds before the onslaught started. And the image, one of a giant mass of 5 dozen rats squeezing between, under, and through garbage in a stuttered, split charge, was one that seared into its mind, a momentary panic freezing its limbs. A panic that shattered like glass when a small rodent it hadn't noticed bit into its right paw, and with a yowl, it snapped its leg up, to its mouth, bit the rodent hanging off its bleeding toe, and threw it into the horde with a whip of its head to buy time. And so the fight began in earnest. The rodent's footing and movements were horrendous, even worse than its own, the tunnel vision making them utterly blind to everything besides tearing the wolf apart, which only made them stumble and fall over each other. A fact the wolf decided to exploit, hoping to catch rodents and use them as projectiles to break their semi-coordinated rush. An isolated, speedy little rat rushed at it, at the forefront. The wolf used its speed to dash forward, snapping its jaws shut over its neck and spine, ready to twist its neck and toss the vermin back to its kin. However, the moment it bit on, it stumbled forwards as something under its front paw broke from the gears, sucking the first section of its leg between fragile glass-like material before it could hop backwards. It clumsily put its weight onto the squeaking, writhing rat with its neck to quickly dig out its leg, then flicked the soon-to-be corpse into the horde, managing to scatter and break a small cluster of rats as it hurriedly jumped backwards. And now it was basically stuck, because the human was right behind it. It moved too far back. It could retreat. It could run away, and let the human get eaten, just to buy itself some time. But the thought, for better or worse, didn't even cross its mind in the heat of the moment. To its right, a rat scurried with surprising speed to snap at its right foreleg, which it curled up to its collarbone before leaning its body forward and slamming its paw into the middle of its back with its entire strength and body weight behind the blow. The smaller rodent's spine snapped with a small, albeit satisfying crack. It turned to see 4 rodents scurry towards it side by side. It quickly battered the leftmost one with its right paw, where it tumbled away into shifting garbage, extended its paw towards the second to bait it into snapping its teeth and pulled its paw back at the last moment, then jumped forward to snap its jaws shut and stab it through the upper spine with its canines, using its right leg to sweep the other 2 rodents away in the same motion. Although that worked remarkably well, that's when it made the same mistake, twice in a row. It moved its hind legs forward to kick its body backwards, but one of its paws slipped off some wet, metallic surface as soon as it extended, continuing with its momentum to almost smack into its own ribs, making it overcompensate to keep itself stable by using its left paw to catch its body weight. Whatever its foot landed on, it folded inwards before tearing apart, further destroying its sense of balance and making it slam shoulder first into a sharp-edged piece of stone. It only barely managed to unlatch its jaws from its latest victim to let out a barking snarl as a rodent jumped onto its right shoulder, and another bounded up towards its head. It thrashed its body wildly to buck off the vermin on top of it, and with the savagery of instinct, chomped down on the rat in front of it, its canines phasing through its sides and stabbing into its organs and legs. But its head was untouched, and beside its mouth. The rodent twisted in its grip and bit into its jowls, and as the wolf wrenched its head to the side to throw the vermin into the horde, it felt the rodent's teeth take their cut of flesh, finally managing to right itself with a snarl, its back fur bristling so harshly that it resembled a mound of spikes atop its spine. It was, for some reason, genuinely furious. The rodent it had bucked off recouped and bit into its hind leg, its teeth only barely managing to pierce through its fur and skin before the wolf twisted its hip and kicked it away like a pebble, hearing its squeak cut abruptly with a wet thud. Fury, its new tendons, the devourer's hunger, and blood rush, all combined to boost its strength to lengths it was unprepared for. But as the rodent horde neared, it wasn't sure if that was going to be enough to overcome sheer numbers. In the darkness, only the brief flashes of orange light illuminated the pit, the human panicking and squirming closer to the wolf with every step as she blasted away stray rodents from her side. They just had to stand their ground until the pipe was revealed. And that was easier said than done. A large cluster of vermin neared and the wolf engaged them instantly, each swipe of its paw sending multiple rodents flying, despite the awkward motion. The hunger in its innards flared, and every passing moment felt like its stomach was turning into a furnace, a roiling, restrained heat in its gut. It snapped its neck forward like a snake to bite the head off a rat, then smashed another with its paw, its abdomen bursting open with a wet squelch on a sharp piece of metal, its pathetic squirming as it succumbed to its injury only furthering the thrumming bloodlust in the wolf's heart. A rodent larger than the human's head let out a squeak so shrill that it cut through the chaos to scrape against the wolf's eardrums, its beady eyes glowing a faint, dark red as it barreled through its own kin with speed that was unnatural, breaking their charge to continue its own. But it was still far, so the wolf continued with what was in front of its snout. Another swipe that threw away a couple rodents, another rat bite on its legs, another 3 swift disembowelments as the wolf braced itself and used its relatively stable footing to snap its head in and out of the quickly thickening wall of vermin, breaking their charges, throwing their bodies away. As long as it kept moving, using its body like a battering ram to knock the rodents away before putting its head into the mess, it would only suffer some minor cuts and bites, and so far, that strategy was working. The bumpy expanse of trash swelled, the ground turning more unstable as the gears started bulging out the mounds of trash. The human behind the wolf screamed, the scent of charred rodent and blood cloying the air, another burst of light illuminating the massive rodent as it clambered onto a metal pipe that jutted upwards in a diagonal, towering over the wolf. Then it jumped forward, a rather clumsy move from a body not made for leaping, powered by frenzied bloodlust and little else. The wolf didn't hesitate. With the rodent in the air, belly down, it was nothing but a bag of meat. It extended its hind legs, curling its forelegs to its chest as it opened its jaws, tilting its head to align its canines. Then it snapped them shut around the rodent's neck and head. Using both its own and the rodent's momentum, it curled its waist to the left, lowering its torso and using the large rat like a sweeping broom to send half a dozen rats flying. Its eyes flicked to the human in between swings of the rodent, each strike sending mangy fur flying away, even as its battering tool tore and crunched. It saw her hyperventilating form desperately pouring her mana into bursts of searing sparks that had far more stopping power than any fire should have, blowing any stray vermin away and buying the wolf precious time to maneuver around. Something the wolf doubted she could keep up for long. They weren't gaining ground nor respite, only buying time. With a continuous, thunderous rumble, the trash slowly rose higher and higher, slowly pushing towards them, the rotation of the gears trapping them in an improvised trench as the terrain beneath their feet swelled, snapped, and tilted at random. The sound was deafening, the air was choked with the miasma of poison and burnt fur. They had even less room to move, the human's blasts only growing less accurate and less powerful as she struggled not to be sucked under with 3 useless limbs. The tide of rodents was stemmed for a moment by the deteriorating ground beneath their feet, many of them losing their footing or falling over in clumps of wriggling filth. The wolf continued moving its head from side to side in wide swings, even as its neck muscles grew sore, its breaths heavy around the corpse in its jaws. But the horde of pushed-back rodents also had the high ground now, burrowing out of moving and crunching garbage. And at that precise moment, the human spell ran out. The vermin were so much faster, its body so much more sluggish. Its balance was off, the constant shifts and snaps making its paws slip and overextend. Then its legs buckled when the terrain underneath it surged upwards with force it wasn't expecting, its extended limbs unable to muster the strength to prevent its chest from smacking into the metal refuse underneath. From above on both flanks, and in the groove before it, the horde stepped on each other just as much as they stepped on trash, the first coherent rush in the fight so far. A tide of black-gray fur washed over the wolf as it flailed under a mass of writhing vermin. It let out a sharp, guttural bark as it used its strength to buck wildly, then hastily planted its feet and slammed its shoulder into the risen garbage on the left, then the right, feeling the sharp crunch and squelch of viscera wash over its sides. It continued its wild motions, using its limbs and body like a battering ram to physically squash or throw the rodents away, eyes clenched shut as black squirming clumps scattered and flew away into the darkness. The ferocity might have worked to keep them from latching on, but not all of them. A rodent bit into its hip, another latched onto the tip of its tail, its teeth hooking into the space between the bony segments, almost severing it. One managed to bite onto its testes, while another held onto its neck and bit onto the base of its ear. 5 others had held onto its fur, biting its sides, trying to dig deeper. Another quickly bit its leg as the wolf prepared to slam its chest into the trash below to squash a rodent that was dangling off its rib, its teeth uselessly scraping against the bone, too tough to snap. Before it could do so, before the pain could even properly register, a blood-curdling shriek sounded out from the human, and the world was suddenly washed away in a wild spew of sparks, a million tiny explosions burning into its retinas, the wild spew sporadically swinging side to side and bouncing off the walls of trash on either side before impacting the wolf itself, throwing away some of the rats, and momentarily making the wolf stumble away. It snapped its feet out just in time to prevent another fall as chunks of its flesh were torn off by the removed rodents. It barely stayed on its feet, then roared out a bark that hurt its throat, thrashing and bucking its body. Another couple of rodents detached, and it raised its head, before swinging it downwards, the rodent chewing off its ear, moving with the momentum to detach with a spray of blood, leaving only a thin film of cartilage to keep its ear connected, blood quickly pooling into the eardrum. It swung its hips for added momentum to slam the rodent attached to its tail into its dazed brethren, uncaring of the tip going with it. Its legs were used to batter, make space, get the rodent hanging off its privates with a lucky scrape of its nail. It used the last few seconds of blood rush to get onto the hysterical human, its stomach over her head, battering away rats with all four legs in rotation, bucking to throw them off, just buying time, eyes wide and teeth bared in a furious snarl. Something in its soul thrashed against its chains, and the wolf felt mental resistance, strain for a moment. By some miracle, the human had enough mana to slap her palm onto its stomach as it rotated in place above her, giving it a weaker boost than before, but a very well-timed one, as blood rush, strength, speed and endurance bled out, leaving its limbs feeling lethargic and slow, uncooperative, the communication between brain and limb feeling slow and sluggish. The human skill helped, but not enough to continue as it had been, the loss in endurance being felt especially hard as its muscles burned with exertion. Its blood had more adrenaline than water in it, and despite the danger, the wolf couldn't help but break from its protective movements, snapping forward with its jaws, whipping its head to the side in a jerky, small motion to throw a rodent away, and in the same movement, clamp onto another. It continued, snapping its teeth shut, flicking rodents away and instantly grabbing onto another in a frenzied mess of blood and viscera, only pausing to use vermin as a sack of meat to batter their brethren away. Despite only two of its limbs ever being used to support its body, the other two kicking and rending shallow cuts in the squirming mounds of fur scrambling for them, it managed to keep itself relatively grounded, its center of balance only wobbling slightly during the fight. Some instinctual part of itself remembered how to keep its balance, only ever keeping the upper parts of its limbs stiff and letting the lower parts move with the bob of the terrain. Its movements grew less restrained, more confident. It swiped two rats away, one of its toe pads paying the price in blood when one of them quickly turned and bit down before the wolf's paw smashed its teeth out of its mouth, and behind them was another monstrously large rodent, almost half the size of the wolf itself, twice as large as the previous biggest it had seen. The heat in its stomach felt like liquid magma eating away at its insides, a blast furnace contained in far too small a vessel. It was the only thing its body felt but a strange, scared sort of excitement, a savage satisfaction in a fight to the death. And it hurt. The rodent lunged for the head, its stubby legs only barely managing to lift its upper body off the ground, its teeth just barely high enough to reach the wolf's neck. In a moment of pure instinct, the wolf turned its upper body to the right, lowered it as much as it could, and the moment the rodent's teeth latched onto its neck fur, exploded to the left, pushing with its shoulder, neck and legs, uncaring of the two thin cuts on its neck as teeth dragged through its fur. The rodent was thrown off balance, head to the sky, and the wolf plunged its canines through its neck and eyes, and used its momentum to continue the motion, using the rodent as a sweep once more, battering away dozens of rodents before they could get to the human, from both the left, right, and sometimes above. Even the new tendons woven around its neck and curled around its spine started to feel the strain by now, but it held its ground, protecting the human and itself with all it had, even as the rapid swinging started making it feel a tad dizzy. The blood loss was probably as responsible for that as its motions were. The trench deepened, tightened, the trash momentarily burying the human's legs, and the wolf barely caught it out of the corner of its eyes, instantly letting its canines phase through the rodent as it kicked with its hind legs to pivot on its forelegs and dash forward. Curiously, even as the human spent every ounce of energy and mana she had blowing or throwing rodents off, she didn't attack the wolf when its jaws tore through her charred pant leg and scraped against her skin, nor as the wolf hauled her broken limbs out the trash. Instead, she let out a guttural groan of pain and blew a wide burst of sparks around her in an awkward semicircle, her injured arm curled around her head protectively. It kicked away a couple rodents, with much more difficulty than before as it did the same with her other leg, the fabric tearing from the strain. The human's voice quickly grew hoarse, but it pulled her leg free after 2 seconds of struggling, and it quickly dashed over her torso to bite into a rodent that was about to bite into her scalp, tossing it away. Then, with a thunderous rumble, the trash went too high, got too unstable, and a tide of uncountable bits, big and small, toppled on top of them like the lid off a coffin, mashing them together, the rodents completely buried all around them. The human had lost her voice at this point, and clumsily threw her hands around the wolf, whose brow was split open by the sharp corner of a metal box, its left eye blinded by its own blood, dizzy and confused. The sudden lack of rodents, the pressure on its upper back, mashing its chest into the human's face, as well as a rather sudden perception of its injuries, made it quickly snap out of its confusion with a growl, flaring its antennae for more information. It was only the speed and perception boost that made the wolf realize what was to come just a split second before it did, and it hurriedly dug its hindlegs' nails into the human's garment, despite feeling a piece of rebar trying to pry its ribcage open. Even if they were in the middle, it quickly became hard to breathe as their sides were squeezed, harder and harder, the wolf's bones creaking under its flesh, slowly getting bruised by a wall of sharp corners and rusted waste as dust hung thick in the air, like trying to breathe in slime. It might have been just 10 or so seconds, but in its entrapped state, it felt like 100 times longer. Then the world dropped out from under them. With the coffin of discard no longer suspended between the gears' crushing pressure, they simply dropped, falling like a conjoined pair of stones in a shower of dust, metal, glass, plastic, and a million other less savory things. The impact might have been lesser had the human not accidentally used it as a cushion for their spinning fall. It was only 6 or 7 feet, but the added weight of the human was enough to make the wolf let out a shrill, sharp yowl as it felt one of its ribs land onto an iron pipe, the snap reverberating through its bones. The human's injuries forgotten, it curled its feet inwards and kicked her off, scrambling to its unsteady feet as it panted, blood foreign and familiar dripping from its mouth. And in the scattered, seemingly nonsensical pattern of holes in the walls, it found the pipe it had been looking towards this entire time, half hidden under a piece of debris, slowly inching upwards. It only wasted a moment to grab onto the human by her collar, its teeth lodged into the tough fabric, and on unsteady, trembling legs, it pulled her along, step by step, getting closer to salvation, feeling a slow, insidious chill slowly move into its body, adrenaline slowly starting to fade and pain slowly creeping back into its body. If the wolf was tired, the human was exhausted, barely conscious, her head limply hanging down as she muttered gibberish. The wolf's blood dripped down its teeth to slowly coat her neck. Its tendons strained like frayed ropes as the wolf dragged her closer to the pipe foot by foot, the scent of the poison slowly filling the air as bits and pieces of trash continued to rain down from above, caught or squished into the gears, occasionally impacting its numb backside. The rodents trapped in the pipe, 8 of them, spotted them just 10 feet away, and quickly jumped off. The wolf felt their squeaks tickle its antennae, the ringing in its ears drowning out most sounds. The trash continued to scrape down the walls inch by inch, and the wolf let go of the human just as her skill faded away, its limbs feeling like they were made of lead. A mass of rodents as large as itself rushed at it, and it could only glare at them with a defiant anger. It didn't have the time nor energy to fight the rodents and drag itself and the human to the pipe before it would be too high for them to jump into. It also knew the other pipes were stuffed full of rodents, even if they weren't near the entrance. In its hazy-eyed state, with one ear and one eye made useless by blood, feeling like a clawing, tearing void was ripping its stomach apart, it gathered all it had, all its fury, all its mana, its breaths ramping up into snarls, one eye glowing red under the veil of its lifeblood and the other gleaming gold as mana flooded its lungs. It needed more. And so it reached deep into the recesses of its mind. Hazy recollections of its old weakness, of running from rodents until it could barely breathe, of a gnawing, empty pit in its stomach, of shivering as its insides chilled to ice despite the sweltering heat of whatever machine it was nestled against, of vomiting until it could barely breathe, poison and blood mixing with whatever scraps it had found to eat, pooling around its snout, of hatred, buried deep, from necessity. Hatred of its kin, biting and chasing it away. Hatred of the machines that burned its eyes, its nose, its lungs. Hatred of the structures that speared into the sky, as if their existence was there simply to remind it of how small, insignificant it was. Hatred of the human's nest. Hatred of itself, when it was too weak to survive. Too weak to find food, too weak to take it from others. So the wolf grasped tight around the lid of the coffin it had trapped its hatred within, and dragged it out, fanned its flames and plastered it to the forefront of its mind. They used to be memories unimportant and fading, emotions fleeting and unnecessary, but for this moment, the wolf gripped onto them with bloody teeth as its lungs burned and swelled with more than simple air. And it waited, 1, 2, 3 seconds, until the rodents were just a foot away. Blood rush, activated. The mana coiled around the air in its lungs, latched onto it like a rabid passenger. Mana turned to sound, and the passenger roared with 100 different shades of fear, fury, hatred and desperation as it rode upon the air that screamed out of its lungs. The pressure felt like a fist being driven through its throat. Its vocal cords snapped like strings almost instantly, trampled underfoot as the mana vein of its throat reinforced the sound waves, propelling the air forward. The tight ball of emotion, sound, and mana finally left the entrance to its mouth. And without the confines of the wolf's circuits, the proximity of its control, it promptly exploded. Blood spewed out of its throat and mouth in a fine mist as a sharp crack of sound drowned out all else, the sphere in its mouth expanding in less than the blink of an eye. Its jaw broke and detached from its joints to dangle lifelessly, the muscles tearing open as one of its canines ripped out of its mouth, and in the last millisecond, whether by luck or instinct, it wrenched its head to the side just enough so the air wouldn't go back down its gullet and rupture its lungs. That didn't stop its neck from being violently wrenched to the side before it could even see the effects of the explosion as it was blasted back by its own skill. Its body spun and flipped in the air chaotically for a few feet before its hind legs smashed into the trash again, promptly crumpling and leaving it to tumble awkwardly on its side. If nothing else, the agony helped it stay awake. With shrill wheezes, it forced itself upright, tilting its blood-filled ear to the side for the crimson liquid to drip out, simply to regain some sense of hearing, as the other one could only hear a high-pitched whine. The pain was not something it had never felt before, but definitely equal to its worst experiences. Yet, the way forward was open, few if any still moving rodents in sight. Step by stumbling step as its sense of balance returned, it managed to drag itself back to the gibbering human, and with some fiddling, managed to hook its top canines into her garment. Through blurred eyes it managed to see what its skill managed to do, from the splattered corpses of the rats that had popped open against the stone wall, from the 8-foot-long cone of destruction that formed a convenient ramp of trash, straight into the drifting pipe. The rest was a blur, of awkwardly adjusting its top canines to properly drag the human, of being thankful for its hanging jaw allowing it to easily spin its canines and cut through the grate, of one long, final stretch of agony as it dragged itself and the grunting human into the city's underbelly. And finally, rest. She'd long since stopped caring about what was even happening around her, or trying to understand it. There were no shrill screams, no chittering, no wriggling horrors trying to eat her piece by piece, and so, she just sat there and waited. Wherever there was. She couldn't really say she was resting, however. It wasn't just the pain nor the slowly encroaching feeling of wrongness in her body. It was the start-stop nature of her rest that left her feeling like she was slowly detaching from reality. Every time she woke up and fell asleep, it felt like there was no transition period, moving seamlessly from one to the other, in increments so small she barely had time to process whether she was dreaming or back into the land of the wakeful. 3 minutes of dreams that were a mixture of bizarre concoctions of her subconscious and simple replays of her memories, 2 minutes of hazy, but real sensations, then back again. And as this continued, she started losing that distinction. She no longer slept or woke up, it was a chaotic jumble of awareness that took her from talking to a faceless acquaintance, and back to a damp, foul-smelling tube of iron where she'd absent-mindedly pet blood-soaked fur until her mind took her away again. So she indulged herself, in sight, sound, whether it was real or a melting fragment of her memories, it didn't matter. That withheld thought of the system tickled at her mind constantly, but she ignored it. Some weak, withered part of her screamed at her to keep going, to keep moving. And she heard that too, she just didn't listen. The metaphorical limbo she found herself in had many layers, and she was slowly being torn between them. To struggle or give up, reality or a dream. The more the cycle continued, the more discontent she felt, her dreams going from comprehensible, to memories, to a mess of impossibilities, and back. And as she used that thin sliver of awareness that came with being awake to think back on her life, she couldn't help but think it was meaningless. Empty faces, inflectionless voices that spoke but said nothing. Dozens of connections thin as strings, snapping under the weight of a gaze full of scrutiny, all but one. Buildings of brass, brick, burnished bronze and glass, foods that were more of a social statement than nutrition. Clothes that hurt to breathe in, that choked her in the stifling heat of summer. A life of slavery. Should any real slave hear that thought that whispered in her ears, she knew they'd snap her neck out of rage, and they'd be justified. Maybe that was just her highborn status that prevented her from seeing just how vast the difference between the two scenarios was. But exchanging a golden birdcage for a dress of rusted chains didn't hold any real significance to her, even if it did to other people. Whether it was nobility rocking her cage and poking their fingers between the bars, or a sleazy bastard like Gar yanking at her leash, what was the difference beyond the conditions? Powerless in one and powerless in the other, unable to do what she really wanted. Not that it mattered. She was probably going to die like this. Forgotten in a rusty pipe. The hazy call to let her mind fade away grew more insistent, and she indulged it, letting her twisting mind take her hand and drag her through the labyrinth it had crafted. She glanced at her teammates as they strolled back to the guild, her steps slowing. She quickly dug out a bronze crown, bending down to offer it to the skeletal child with a wooden cup sitting by his legs. He didn't react whatsoever, and after another quick glance at her team, she simply put it into the kid's empty cup. Still no reaction, his head hanging down. Her heart ached at how exhausted the poor kid must be. But she had also learned of how cruel life was on the third floor, so she shook him from his shoulder to wake him up, just so the kid wouldn't have his money taken by some random passerby. "Hey, kid?" she whispered with a small, friendly smile, expecting him to startle awake. He didn't react, completely limp, his head swinging in time with her movements. He was, too limp. She lowered her hand to touch his arm. And it was ice cold. She jerked her hand back, eyes wide. As if in slow motion, he fell sideways, his rough, dirty rags scraping against the wall as if they were made of wood. Two empty, lifeless eyes stared at her boots. She jumped to her feet, staggering back, hyperventilating. The world swam like paint dissolving into water. A slap that almost threw her to the floor snapped her out of it. Gar's scowling face blurred into sight, his fist bunching into her robes and dragging her away. Some part of her understood, acknowledged it, yet another refused to accept it. She hastily wiped the tears out of her eyes and started to turn her head around. She knew that she would turn and find a shivering kid, staring in wonder at the bronze crown, and he would flash her a thankful grin, full of childlike innocence in the hellish pit that was this place, and everything would be normal. But all she saw was someone bending down to take the coin before continuing on their way, not even sparing the corpse a second glance. She stared at the coins in her hand. Furious green eyes flashed up to glare at a faceless man, only vague outlines of his features showing. "What the hell is this? Payment?" He shrugged, a smug, shit-eating grin on his face. It somehow felt much more sincere than his friendly, charming smile, and she cursed herself for not seeing it before. She grit her teeth, nostrils flaring. "This is 1 bronze coin. The payment for the job was 1 silver. You said we all take an equal cut." "Yeah, I did. Never signed anything though, did I?" "You did." He shrugged again, gesturing with his chin at the book hanging off her hip. Her shaking hand clutched the coin in her palm as she closed her eyes, a hissing breath of fury leaving her. She wouldn't be able to pay off the debt. She'd become a slave, to them, of all people. How could she have been so stupid? Of course this happened. Why did she assume the best of people? She opened her eyes to a room of opulence. Her all-too-familiar cage, drowned in the pale orange of dusk as a silken pillow cradled her head. A knock on the door shook her out of her restless thoughts. "My lady?" A shaky whisper came from the door, and her eyes widened. She knew what that tone meant. She dreaded when the time would come for her to hear it again. She launched herself out of the bed, uncaring of her covers hitting the floor, and she almost joined them in her haste to throw herself at the door. She swung it open, and her eyes widened in horror. Her sight blurred with tears. "Oh God, Catherine," she croaked out, her eyes tracing the black mess of bruises that covered half her friend's face. "It's not your fault," her friend, maid, and shield said in a whisper full of conviction, her features showing more pain for Imhriel than herself. She choked down a sob as she ushered her in, and forced her still bleeding form to sit onto her bed, dragging out a chest of medical supplies out of her closet, her tears almost choking her as she applied the healing paste on the whip marks covering her friend's backside. "It's not your fault, Imhriel," Catherine would whisper, each repetition as painful as a shard of glass being driven into her chest. Because repeating something didn't make it true. It simply made the words lose all meaning. Despite her protests, she didn't let Catherine lift a finger that night, and long after she'd fallen asleep on her bed, face down and having difficulty breathing right, she could only stare at her friend's injuries in horror and dig her nails into her scalp until she felt the warm trickle of blood mar her fingers and stain her auburn hair. Her parents had seen how close she'd gotten to her maid. So why waste money on healing Imhriel from her beatings for public appearances when they could instead use her maid as a punching bag? Every mistake was a slap, every month's end that she didn't unlock the skills and paths her parents wanted her to get was another night that Catherine spent tied to a wooden post, whipped until she could barely walk. She hated her family. She hated them so much. She wanted to put them in a cage, cover them in midnight oil and burn them to a crisp, inhale their exhumed flesh as they begged and screamed and burned. She needed an outlet for her anger, so she simply stood in silence, hands clutching her hair as she imagined her family dying in all the most horrific ways she could imagine, even if she knew she'd never have the guts or conviction to ever do such things to anyone. She blinked. She stood opposite to her maid, a bittersweet tang in her heart as she cast a low-power spark burst to light her papers of ownership on fire. "You're free," she whispered to her friend, with a smile full of happy tears. Catherine just stared wide-eyed, stunned, at the fading embers of her shackles as they flew off into the afternoon breeze, the orange motes of light reflecting in her brown eyes. The bag she'd given her fell from her limp fingers, the clinking of coins impossibly loud in the quiet, disbelieving silence. "And, so am I. I'm sorry for everything. You deserve be better. You always did. A better friend. Someone who had more spine, who could prevent the scars on your back. Someone who would have done this sooner. I am sorry. Goodbye," she eked out, her voice warbly and her heart torn between feeling joy and agony. She turned away, walking towards the dungeon, praying to God she didn't believe in for Catherine to find and lead a happy life, away from her. A life free, away from someone as worthless as she, as powerless, as cowardly, as passive, as defeatist, and a million other insults that all rang true. Some deep, selfish part of her wished that Catherine would stop her, demanding that she come with her. Tell her that she still wished to come with her, to brave the wonders and horrors of the dungeon with her. But that never came, and she held the fragments of her heart in place until she booked a room and cried into a pillow for a day straight. A shove against her uninjured shoulder startled her awake from her half-sleep, and she tensed for a moment, until the breathing of the beast reminded her of reality. It chuffed and poked her again, albeit with less force. She resumed petting its bloody hide, and it grumbled before going still, whatever she'd been doing to disturb it assumedly having been dealt with. Her mind wandered back to the strangely clear memories her mind confronted her with. And in them, she found a spark. Albeit she kept the emotion buried for the most part, she knew she had an abundance in self-loathing. She hated how easily she gave up in the face of adversity, how easily she folded under social pressure. How easily she shied away from confrontation, how easily she let others trample over her and all she cared about, both because of mental and personal weakness. She wanted to live, to change. To see her best and only friend just one more time. To enjoy a free life. To help whoever deserved it. It was a vague outline of what she wanted, but it was enough. It was somehow telling of how pathetic she was, that the motivation, drive and determination to change her life, came when she was at the very brink of losing it, but she could work with it. Despite those bold words however, her mind and body were still battered, and her awareness quickly grew hazy and forgetful, fading away as her fingers grew still in the beast's fur. Her last conscious thought as she was whisked away into another dream, buried under 100 unpleasant emotions and sensations, was that she was probably dying from infection and starvation and that's why she couldn't stay awake despite the pain. That was actually funny, for some godforsaken reason. She snickered as she was swept into another dream. Her eyes raked down a page covered in passages that her brain refused to interpret nor ascribe meaning to, and she hissed in frustration, pressing her palms into her eyes. She tried again. Words turned to syllables before her tired eyes, syllables turned to letters, letters turned to meaningless symbols. She couldn't read a single word. She tried again. With great effort and grit, she got herself to read the paragraph, at the speed of a snail, but correctly. And the moment her eyes landed on the final dot, she realized that she had no idea or recollection of what she had just read. A pure, empty blankness. "Recite the page for me. Or at least that paragraph you've been looking at for the past hour," her mother instructed, a thin veneer of calmness in her voice that couldn't hide the overwhelming weight of disappointment in her gaze. She grit her teeth, struggling to withhold a childish tantrum. "I can't," she grit out, resisting the urge to sob. How many hours had it been? 17? A full day? All she knew was that her brain refused to function anymore. Her studying for the past 4 hours had been utterly meaningless, and still, she was forced to continue. "I see. And you have not gained any skill so far, correct?" her mother coldly asked, less of a question and more of an accusation. "No," she answered for the 50th time. Again. "No," she growled, her eyes and fists clenched shut. "Look at me," her mother said, her voice calm, yet sharp and dangerous like the edge of a drawn blade. Imhriel tensed and gulped, before gritting her teeth, her anger far outweighing her caution for a moment. She turned to her mother with eyes that refused to focus, narrowed in a glare. A pulsing agony that covered half her face, and her sudden change in view, were the things that made her shocked mind understand what happened, the sound of the slap still echoing down the hallway. Tears ran down her face as her teeth gnashed. I was not asking. Again. She snapped back into the land of the living with a gasp in her throat and a strange-sounding snarl in her ear, the beast's fur bristling under her fingers. And she felt that its attention was on her, somehow, so she didn't move, nor breathe, shocked out of any kind of rest. The strange snarl quickly died down, and the beast chuffed, its fur settling down. A light, barely perceptible sting accompanied the pounding headache in her mind, and she idly realized she was crying. Stupid nightmares. Her groggy mind slowly realized that she was probably making noise in her sleep, as she couldn't find any other reason for the beast to be growling at her. The sudden kick of adrenaline helped startle her body and mind into activity, at least, and despite feeling like she could barely even think, much less make any sort of decent decision, she focused on that background process of her mind dedicated to the system, and her progress revealed itself. She had wallowed in self-pity and self-loathing enough. She had to focus on getting out of this shithole first, however unlikely. You have progressed on your path. Infuser, Level 8 Level 12. Available attribute points, 4. Attributes. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +1. Perception, +0. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +4. Soul, +2. Impressive as it was to gain 4 entire levels in a single fight, she couldn't find it in herself to be impressed or even happy about it. She quickly threw her points according to her current situation, and moved on. Endurance, +3. Perception, +2. Or would have, had she not been momentarily stunned by how much better she felt by adding 2 points into endurance. Aches lessened, the squirming of her insides became less prominent in her mind, the shivering cold of hunger in her gut lessened, and the uncomfortable heat became a little more bearable as a surge of energy rushed through her. It felt like her limbs were made of timber rather than weak flesh as her heart swelled with blood and vitality. Even her mind cleared up, if only a little. The sensations from perception's upgrade were empowered, sounds became louder and easier to tell the direction of, scents became annoyingly easy to notice. Yet, much like she'd overheard from conversations, it didn't feel attention-grabbing, nor overwhelming. She focused back on the letters in front of her as soon as she was done noting the various, but small, improvements. Acquired skills. You have gained the skill, Tough Skin, Level 1. You have gained the skill, Infection Resistance, Level 1. You have gained the skill, Disease Resistance, Level 1. Infection Resistance, has leveled up. Level 1 Level 2. Disease Resistance, has leveled up. Level 1 Level 2. Spark Burst, has leveled up. Level 13 Level 16. Haste, has leveled up. Level 10 Level 14. Pain Resistance, has leveled up. Level 14 Level 18. Poison Resistance, has leveled up. Level 8 Level 9. Mana Tank, has leveled up. Level 1 Level 2. Mana Conduit, has leveled up. Level 1 Level 3. Acquired traits. Enduring, 1/5. You have felt the chill of death multiple times, and survived. You are slightly tougher. The system unfortunately told her what she'd known and been fearful of admitting, in the form of giving her 2 resistance skills. She had an infection. Honestly, she'd be more surprised if she didn't have one, or multiple. During that chaotic mess of fighting, her broken hand had been used as a chewing toy for the worthless fucking vermin. Her train of thought stopped for a moment as she took a moment to parse her surprise. That thought was a little sudden. She couldn't say it wasn't genuine, but even in her own mind, she rarely thought of anything or anyone with such intense hatred, except her parents. She remembered her earlier dream of her parents and the fleeting thought of burning them, and as a thought experiment, imagined a cage full of rodents being tossed into an open fire. The amount of savage glee she felt at the thought was, frankly, a little terrifying. She couldn't even care about her deteriorating mental state, however, not right now. She instead focused back to the steady, pulsing pain in her right arm. With much difficulty and strained grunting, she managed to bring it up next to her head, using her working arm to poke and prod it. There were multiple spots where new wounds and bites were made, and despite their small overall damage, the problem was in the very, very obvious infection. If the throbbing waves of pain in her arm were enough to punch through a level 18, pain resistance, she knew she'd probably be screaming in pain if she lowered the skill's power. Gingerly, she poked and felt around the skin, the mental image in her mind growing more vivid and more dire by the second. The skin felt like it was overlaid atop a furnace rather than her flesh, hot to the point of concern. And around each bite mark, big and small, was a far more concerning numbness, a certain wetness and toughness to the injury that couldn't be justified by congealed blood. Infection was often the first step, occurring when filth or disease entered one's body and began to spread. Disease occurred when the body was damaged as a result of the infection and signs and symptoms of an illness appeared. Which meant that, infection resistance, was a lost cause by now, she was already infected. The skill would hardly help her. All she had to deal with this problem was, disease resistance, and her own body's natural resistances, whatever they were. Even if she knew what had to be done, it was difficult to visualize, much less seriously consider. And there were so many things that could go wrong. While the beast could cut iron somehow, she didn't know if she could get it to cut her arm off, not without sight and unable to make it understand her. At worst, she might even make it think that she was inviting it to eat her, absurd as that sounded. She also didn't know if she'd be able to bear the pain of cauterizing it either, despite her skill almost tripling her pain tolerance. What she did know was that at this point, her right arm was disposable. So she could experiment as she wanted, really. It was inflamed from the constant agitation of her broken bones, full of filth and infected. Sooner or later, it would kill her. The least she could do was put the damn thing to use before she got rid of it, one way or another. The problem was that she had no idea what to experiment with. She'd long since forgotten all her harebrained ideas, speculations, and random bouts of inspiration when it came to magic, beaten out of her by quill and fist. Her thoughts wandered to the single common point all mages had, which was a minor form of telemancy, moving things with their mana. And an idea began to form. She gingerly moved some mana out of the exit point in her palm, feeling it appear like a thin coating around her arm. Like a potentially teleporting, intangible, immaterial gas. That isn't affected by air, gravity, or most natural laws. Quite simple, really. She remembered those words clearly, and struggled not to snort. Her teachers had rarely indulged her undying curiosity of magic, as they had been instructed not to by her parents, but when they did, it was both enlightening and baffling. She gripped the sleeve of mana with her mind, and began pressing. She knew that the break was in her forearm, roughly, but she wanted to see if she could get a more accurate spotting of the issue. A poke at her elbow sent a spike of pain a little above the joint, so she gingerly poked there too. She felt neither a shift, nor a grind of bone, so she mentally noted that to be a fracture at worst. She pressed a little higher, and felt a much more violent spike of pain, followed by insistent pulses of the feeling all along the path of her limb. A poke a little bit above the previous one made her shoulders tighten and jaw clench, as the pain was accompanied by the extremely uncomfortable sensation of broken bone parts grinding against one another. And then she got another idea. The thin coat of mana around her arm tightened, thickened. And with careful precision, she pressed down gently along her forearm in a firm cylindrical shape. Then she shifted, to move her hand just a bit, a cautious press of mana keeping the bone set. Of course, the mana splint was far from perfect. It was very mentally taxing to keep it going, to keep the pressure rigid and consistent, and despite her best efforts to control the mana properly to minimize energy bleed, even a small splint like this was draining her mana a little faster than she could generate it, even as she used mana conduit, as soon as it was available, constantly. It wasn't quite as delicate as some of the common exercises for mana control, like spinning a pen in place, rolling it, or spinning it in all of its axes without dropping it or launching it at herself, but the wider scope made it harder for her mind to focus on all of it at once. Still, it was something. In a moment of free fall, or perhaps while getting dragged, it could help save her legs, at least, even if the arm wasn't salvageable. Telemancy was a strange but common form of magic. Inefficient in how much mana it burned to move things, with a very high degree of control needed to be used offensively, and easily disrupted by other mages. It was considered more of a show of mastery and a good way to train rather than something genuinely useful in any offensive capacity, regardless of skills. Considering kinetic implied someone who was locked into their inherent magic type, and mancy meant that it was learned magic, there was a lot of debate on whether it should even be classified as a mancy, when even the most untrained of mages could make a pen slide across a table with mana, for example. The kinetics. A telemancer to a telekinetic was the difference between a kitchen knife and a greatsword in terms of danger. The control and power that one gained by being born with inherent magic was nigh impossible to match, even if it restricted them from using any other type of magic. If only she'd been born a telekinetic, she wouldn't be mentally ranting just to pass the time. She'd be delving into the dungeon and tearing apart iron golems like they were made of paper. With a shift of her hips, which had been hurting less and less, surprisingly, and were probably not broken because of that, her attention was drawn to the stifling tightness of her pants and iron greaves. The latter was actually good, as the knee-length iron had kept her lower legs relatively safe from jostling. It wasn't exactly a splint, but it was tight enough to let the bones heal, albeit slowly, as long as she didn't contract the muscles that made her feet move. The former, however, was simply because her pants were burnt, pretty badly too. They were made of thick, threaded wool, so while they offered great protection from cuts and stabs, they burned pretty easily. In some spots, she could even feel the humid air meet her skin, which was definitely not good. In the heat of the moment, it wasn't like she had any other option to get the damn rats off her. She just hadn't realized how strong Sparkburst had been getting lately. At the first couple levels, she distinctly remembered how it would only light a paper on fire 2 out of 3 times, usually just tearing it up into lightly smoking bits of paper with the micro-explosions of the sparks. The progress was a balm on her soul, even if it cost her the protection of her leggings. She sighed, a low, croaky sound, and continued applying the telekinetic splint on her arm, adding a repulsion field around it, just strong enough to have it float off the ground a little. Mostly because she felt like a repulsion field would be extremely effective in breaking any strong shocks before they snapped her bones back out of place. With any luck, she might even get a skill to make this stuff easier, but the system was a cruel, unpredictable, and impossible to figure out little bastard, as evidenced by the fact she spent literal years without getting a single one of the skills that would make life easier for her, while some people got skills by doing something once or twice. Some people got skills about telemancy after spinning a pen for a couple minutes, while others just never gained it. There was a loose understanding of desire and struggle being the 2 foremost things that decided on what the system gave someone and how quickly they leveled it, but it was all conjecture and speculation. Whatever the justifications the science gave for why the eye and the stupid system it had made were the way they were, she was never not going to be resentful that she never got a single medical or studying-related skill, even though she knew damn well that she genuinely wanted them, at least at the time. She could almost hear some snooty priest recite the whole "the eye knows us better than we know ourselves" spiel. It kind of pissed her off. Deciding not to waste her mana, she lessened the repulsion field and softened the grip of mana around her arm, using just enough mana to keep the exercise going for as long as possible while keeping herself topped up. She didn't know if her body had a limit on how much mana it could store in its circuits, but she felt like she had about half again her normal mana capacity at the moment. And now to just keep practicing, with the vague hope that the beast will continue to cart her around. Yep. Just keep going. Gods, she was so bored. It felt absurd to say that she was bored in her situation, but now that she was somewhat awake, the only thing she had to focus on was the telemancy splint that she'd fashioned for herself. It was rather tempting to make the beast say some stupid stuff just to pass the time, maybe relieve some stress through the humorous absurdity of such things, but it seemed to be very grouchy at the moment, so she opted not to bother it anymore. Sleep was near instant. The moment it deemed its environment safe, it simply collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, uncaring of the human's pained grunt as it accidentally flipped her onto her stomach from its sudden yank at her collar. You have progressed on your path. Hound of the Keeper, Level 9, Level 16. Available attribute points, 7. Attributes. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +2. Perception, +1. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +4. Soul, +1. The wolf didn't spend even a moment to read or consider the symbols, brushing them aside, forcefully telling the symbols to leave it alone. Surprisingly, it worked, and its body came into view. Or feeling, rather. It was still a strange sensation. The damage was much less dire than it had assumed it would be, the points it had in endurance showing their worth. The problem was that its wounds were still very much open, and bleeding very heavily. It was a wonder how it even had the presence of mind to fix itself. Thankfully, pinching veins shut was a matter of seconds, however numerous they were, and in short order, it felt like it had at the very least stabilized itself for the blood loss to no longer be a threat. It started on a quick overall assessment of its injuries. Its bottom right canine had been ripped out of its mouth completely, and its jawbone had broken at the middle point, on both sides, creating a thin sleeve of cartilage around the bone and its fragments to keep them pressed together, before urging its body to connect the bone again, was a matter of a couple minutes. It assigned the cartilage to be cannibalized by its skill, slowly, just to make sure the bone fixed properly. Turns out, the amount of lost tissue when bone snapped was actually minimal. It would be very different if the bone was pulverized or outright removed, but a simple break would heal faster than even a flesh wound. It was too microscopic an injury once it forced its bone pieces to press together. At the thought of a flesh wound, it focused on where its jawbone limply hung, connected to its head by skin and little else, and proverbially growled in annoyance. The muscles, tendons, and joints were all damaged. The muscles were torn apart, one of the tendons to the right side was snapped clean, and bits of cartilage around the joint were broken and stripped from the bone, not to mention the obvious problem of the bone being detached. Pushing the bone back into place was fairly simple, and fixing the torn-up bits of cartilage around the bone was a fairly quick process. The muscles would take a bit longer to repair, as the damage was more extensive than simple muscle fibers being snapped, and the tendon was a relatively quick fix. It just had to grab the two ends and stick them together before focusing as much essence as it could into reconnecting the two pieces. It knew that slower healing took less essence to complete, as speed seemed to cost just as much essence as fixing the wounds itself, but it had plenty of material in storage, so it could afford to be a bit wasteful. Its tail would take a couple days to return to its previous state, but it wasn't a particularly necessary limb, so the wolf didn't bother speeding the regenerative process along, just giving it an average amount of essence. Thankfully it only lost a single canine from that ill-thought-out blast of sound, and it sped up its body with the process of making a new one, hoping that the cutting power of its old tooth would somehow transfer. Because no matter how much it looked into its teeth, it couldn't find out anything about them, not really. When nearing a bone, it could see the microscopic fibers that it was made up of, but there was no such thing for its teeth. They were just perfect. Perfectly smooth, perfectly dense, it couldn't even tell if they were made of bone at all. Just some white, inscrutable substance, harder than anything it could even imagine. It didn't know how to replicate them. Fixing its right ear was also a rather quick fix, only taking a couple minutes. It just had to grab onto the flopping part of its ear with its mind, yank it back into place, and then use tiny bits of stretchy muscle to connect the pieces and rebuild the veins, cartilage, and skin. Then it suddenly realized that it had been moving its body this entire time, in a way. It had made muscles, and used them like a tentacle to connect to the other piece of its ear like a spider's strings to fix the cartilage and skin. It had grabbed pieces of its bones with its mind and pushed them together, used muscles to adjust and tighten them together. So, its leg, from where it was mushed beneath its chest, restricting the blood flow and making pins and needles punch through the skin, slowly moved. A sense of jubilation and absurd giddiness went through the wolf. It could move in its sleep. It activated, blood rush, disbelieving of the fact that the skills worked in its sleep. Then it grabbed onto its body, and slowly pushed its leg out from underneath it into a better position. It was a strange sensation. Unlike moving normally, where the mind put forth a command, and the body followed, this was a far more direct method, no middleman in the form of nerves, no muscle memory to guide its movements with the force of habit. It was awkward, and stilted, and took a lot of focus, but as long as it was in the devourer skill, it could quite literally walk while asleep, judging by how it made its legs trot in the air as it lay on its side. Of course, it couldn't shake away that mental dismissal of its senses, its hearing and smell incredibly muted, and its sight. It forced its eyelids open. A blurry mess met its sight, and the shackles of sleep threatened to slide away the more visual stimuli its eyes encountered, but in the dark iron pipe they were in, that was hardly a problem. The problem was that the attempt to focus on both the sensation of its body and the visual stimuli was quickly giving it a headache. Maybe it could do something with this in the future. Walking with its mind while asleep, albeit mildly dangerous due to the loss of senses, could be useful for exercising in its sleep or such things. But for the moment, it was a distraction, so it simply stopped, trying to remember what it was doing before. Fixing itself. Some repairs other than the ones it had already done would take a day or two, like the chunks of meat missing, the tip of its tail, and its vocal cords, but the most annoying part to get rid of would be its own reproductive organs. Because as it had learned, those were nothing but a weak point that it had simply not thought of removing until now. Cannibalizing the organ was a matter of a few days, and rebuilding it for whatever reason wouldn't take much longer. Actually, if it wanted to make pups, it could just give itself a womb and inseminate itself without having to worry about finding a female canine and protecting her, so its reproductive organs weren't even useful for reproduction. It paused for a moment, genuinely considering the idea. It was weird. Its mind rejected the idea out of some odd sense of revulsion, as it was a male, but it couldn't deny that having an actual pack of kin at its side was an appealing idea, and that impregnating itself was the safest and best way to achieve that, regardless of how uncomfortable the notion made it. It was also impractical, as food was already relatively scarce around the human nest, and the wolf had no real idea of how to raise, control, or care for pups, as it had no memory of itself being one, but it was an interesting idea for the distant future, perhaps. Putting that idea aside for now, it focused on another weak point it had felt acutely during the fight. Endurance. Not the attribute, but its body's capability to keep going. In a fight that lasted a mere 2 or 3 minutes, it had gone from fresh and hale to completely exhausted. It had grown, its muscle mass almost doubling since its acquisition of the symbols, but it hadn't properly gained the energy to sustain that meager mass and power. So it focused on its cardiovascular system. Veins widened and thickened, stabbing deep into muscles that were not supported by a proper blood flow until now, a terrible oversight. Its lungs expanded, as much as it could spare without squishing other organs. It moved its diaphragm down, let its organs shift lower to make some space. The muscles of the diaphragm itself were strengthened, the muscle fibers hardening, toughening, but not multiplying, just to make rapid breathing easier. It knew that exercise would vastly improve its cardiovascular system, but it didn't know how exactly, so all its changes were mere approximations and imitations. For all it knew, it could barely be improving itself compared to normal exercise. When it had some free rein to run around and test its endurance and what effect exercise would have on itself, it would do so, but at the moment this was the best it could come up with. There was so much more it could fix, that it felt a little overwhelmed with the possibilities, and that was without considering things that it could outright change. It spent much time considering the natural chemicals its body produced, one of which greatly helped it during the fight. Adrenaline, that made its veins sing in ecstasy, that helped its muscles push beyond their limit, that made it want to throw away caution and charge into the bloodbath. It was the equivalent to a minor blood rush, without the added endurance. Additionally, its abdomen was still mostly empty. So it quickly made some glands within the flimsy cage of bone in its abdomen that would slowly but surely produce this chemical and store it in sacs just beside the glands. The sacs connected to the bloodstream in a simple one-way valve system that was used in various other parts of its body, and it surrounded them in a thin sleeve of muscle that could squeeze and force adrenaline into the bloodstream. Getting muscle memory to connect to its brain took a bit longer, but it would be complete sooner than later, and it would have adrenaline whenever it needed it. The sacs were rather large, and the glands were rather small, but that was all right. It expended some essence from Devourer, a tiny amount, that would be dedicated to creating the chemical alongside the glands just to boost production. If and when its body would start building a tolerance for this natural chemical, it would simply wipe that tolerance away to maintain its potency, allowing it to always have an additional and natural boost in any fight it got into. After applying these changes, it was displeased to note that they would, for one reason or another, take a couple days to be made. It still wasn't sure of what factors made a change take less or more time, but the skill wasn't very forthcoming with how it worked. Another quick check of its injuries revealed some sort of blight, an unknown something that the wolf knew was detrimental to itself, some sort of infection or poison. Destroying it was laughably easy, however, as it simply turned to its own immune system and buffered it with as much essence as it dared to, with the vague direction of attacking the foreign filth. The infection would soon be gone entirely, so. The hand that rested on its fur suddenly tightened to the point of mild pain, and the wolf was thrown out of its rest. Its eyes flew open, and its head rose and swerved to observe its surroundings. The downwards tilting pipe was secure from the poison, as it couldn't rise upwards, and it could neither hear nor feel any rodent approaching, just a few of them in neighboring pipes. Seeing no danger, it flattened its antennae and turned to the whimpering, squirming human as its hand tightened and jerked, her paw clenching its fur. Likely having a nightmare. It carefully aimed with its hind paw, and roughly shoved her uninjured shoulder, simultaneously annoyed and sympathetic. It had things to do, and while it knew nightmares sucked, its rest was far more important at the moment. The human thankfully startled awake, so it went back to sleep with a grumble, ignoring her words again. It took a minute, but it returned to its body, just observing, not doing anything for a few minutes. Absent-mindedly, it fixed all scrapes, bruises, minor injuries, and returned to a mindless fugue of hesitation. Its changes would kick in, some soon, some later, but now it was out of ideas, and was more concerned with a different problem. Frankly, it had forgotten about the human until now. And it wasn't sure what it wanted to do with her. It didn't particularly need her. She'd helped it finally understand how to use the Echoes of Oblivion skill, and it was extremely grateful for that, but her usefulness had pretty much expired now. The wolf could learn words and how to speak them, as well as what they meant, simply from observing other humans, and watching her move her mana around had stopped being useful to the wolf. Until now, she wasn't a liability. In that fight to escape the poison, she'd more than proven her worth, even with 3 semi-useless limbs, keeping the rodents off its back, giving the wolf some boosts in speed and perception that greatly helped. But now it was in unknown, unfamiliar territory. Dangerous territory. Dragging her around would slow the wolf down, hurting its stealth capabilities. And the tightness of the pipes made it difficult to properly drag the human along. This was territory that the human would be nothing but a liability in. And yet, despite all that, it didn't really want to leave her here. It could acknowledge that at this point, it was simply acting on emotion, but it had never spent so long with another living being, never slept alongside them for days on end, never shared its food with another. This was the first connection it had ever made, and some primal, social part of its mind that had grown atrophied, was now preening in contentment just from being around the human. If anything, she was like a giant, weakling pup that the wolf had been taking care of for a week or more. In the future, this connection could yield great things for the wolf. Maybe the human would give it food on a steady basis, allowing it to taste and experience more things without putting itself in danger. Maybe the human would give it ideas and talk to it, when it could finally talk back to her. Maybe the wolf would be the one to need her assistance, and she would come. But truthfully, all those thoughts were merely the wolf trying to justify why it was prepared to put in so much effort into keeping her alive. It was well aware of that fact, but it couldn't help itself. It liked having her around, even if she tried to attack it once. In what felt like a lifetime ago, it remembered understanding just how truly alone it was, the last of its own kin, the only wolf it had ever seen, feeling its heart crushed by loneliness. That emotion felt so far away now, so muted when it simply stuck around the human, her petting hand like a brush that painted over that feeling with every stroke. Maybe once she was better, she would turn away and never come back, but that was fine. It still wanted to try. Sure, it knew damn well that if push came to shove, it would turn tail and run to preserve its own life, whether the human survived or not, but until that moment came, it couldn't find it in itself to abandon her just because she was mildly inconvenient. It could eat any human, any one of its canine kin, but this particular human it was the wolf's human. As long as she acknowledged that the wolf was in charge of this bizarre, makeshift pack, it would protect her. That was a good point for its thoughts to reach absolvement, it believed. Then the human started making her sad yipping noises again, and the wolf woke up again. It tried to snarl, only for a wheeze to come out. Right, it forgot about that. It activated logotexnia, and with a bit of focus, managed to push some air out of throat and use the mana of its body to weave sound waves into the air, into a rough approximation of its snarl, letting its fur bristle in warning. Getting woken up constantly was getting really annoying. The human once more woke up, and stiffened, the light scent of fear entering its nostrils as her sound stilled. And now it felt bad. Great. It let up and relaxed, cutting off the sound of its snarl. It quickly fell asleep again, the human petting its fur, a luxury it was unused to. With one last check over to make sure it didn't miss anything to improve or fix within its body, it called the symbols back with a thought, which surprisingly worked. Available attribute points, 7. Attributes. Strength, +0. Speed, +0. Dexterity, +0. Endurance, +2. Perception, +1. Resolve, +1. Intelligence, +4. Soul, +1. 7 whole points. And it knew exactly what it was going to put them in. Speed, +1. Intelligence, +5. Endurance, +7. For a moment, it felt its bones turn to steel, its flesh harden into marble, the beat of its heart a thunderous boom, its very body suffused with a feeling of invincibility. Unfortunately, the feeling faded quickly, yet not entirely. Its body felt harder, tougher, lighter. Every breath felt unnecessary, as if it could just stop breathing and its body would keep working for hours on end, vitality and power seeping into every fiber of its body. It was intoxicating. Addicting. It wanted more. Knowing that it had no more points, however, it ushered forth the rest of the symbols. Acquired skills. You have gained the skill, Sonic Blast, Level 1. You have gained the skill, Tremor Sense, Level 1. Dash, Pain Resistance, has leveled up. Level 17, Level 19. Dash, Restful Awareness, has leveled up. Level 6, Level 15. Dash, Tough Skin, has leveled up. Level 2, Level 4. Dash, Mana Manipulation, has leveled up. Level 4, Level 6. Dash, Blood Rush, has leveled up. Level 3, Level 5. Dash, Logotexnia, has leveled up. Level 1, Level 4. It stared at Restful Awareness in mild confusion tinted with disbelief. 9 whole levels. Just for moving around a bit in its sleep? That was absurd, if it actually had any effect. And the Tremor Sense skill meant that it could get more skills out of its Devourer skill by changing its body? If it added a venomous tooth, would it get some skill about venom then? That seemed like it was heavily incentivizing the wolf to stray from its original biology, even if the only thing, Tremor Sense, did was make interpreting the signals its antennae picked up a little bit easier and a little bit more accurate. With the symbols having nothing else to show it, it returned to its body, and got to work on making a skin sac full of hypernutritional blood for the human to drink. Just to make sure it wouldn't be a hindrance, the wolf made the sac thin, without blood vessels, and without any pain receptors. The blood it put in there was not exactly blood. It removed much of the blood plasma and filled the liquid with tons of nutritional things it usually found in meat, even if it wasn't exactly sure what they were, a lot of water, and filled it chock full of vitamins, as many as it could. The change would take an hour or two, so it simply allowed its body to fade away, its mind finally resting along with its body. When it was done sleeping, it got up, letting the human's petting hand slide off, and with a low groan, put its butt high in the air and stretched its forelegs as far away as they would go, its chest brushing against rusty iron with a low yawn. Nothing felt quite as good as a long nap. Its jaw wasn't hanging anymore, as the jawbone was back in its place and the muscles were mostly repaired, but it was still quite tender and painful. It poked the small nub of bone coming out of its bottom right canine with its tongue, noting that it felt exactly like its other teeth, much to its relief. It turned around to the human, who was still doing something weird to her arm with mana, and lowered its head to hook its top canines through her right shoulder garment. With a minor bit of readjustment, it wrenched its head to the side to flip the human onto her back. With a bit of groaning and a lot of effort on the human's part, they managed to turn her around, despite the pipe's relatively narrow confines. The wolf lifted its right paw, staring at the jiggling sack of skin attached to the inside of its foreleg. It was weird. And mildly repulsive, which was a rare thing for the wolf to think of anything, when it had to swim through literal rivers of shit more than once in its life. Regardless, it wasn't like it was going to wound itself to feed the human some blood, so this would do. It lowered its right paw and lifted its left to poke the human's mouth covering, and after a moment of incomprehension, she understood, voluntarily lifting the fabric and opening her mouth. It put its left paw back down and lifted its right paw again, as far up as it could, and awkwardly twisted its head, trying to find a decent spot to poke a hole in. After a moment of visualizing, it quickly poked a hole into the sack and hurriedly lined up the thin stream of pinkish blood to land in her mouth, bits of the liquid being wasted on her collarbone and hair. Its consistency was more like water, and the human's confusion was almost a tangible thing that hung in the air as she hurriedly gulped down the liquid. The steady stream slowed to a trickle, and the wolf, deciding the human had enough and growing annoyed with holding the awkward pose, curled its leg inwards and quickly bit off the skin sack, chomping it down and hurriedly swallowing it. It had a very strange taste. "What the fuck?" the human whispered, sounding odd, and seeming far more energetic than before. That was odd, especially considering that her arm was infected, but the wolf didn't pay it much mind, flaring its antennae and using the help of Tremor Sense to figure out a decent path to the surface, almost dragging its snout across the pipe's confines. It didn't find much. The pipe they were in continued to climb upwards for 200 or so feet, at a thankfully low angle, before curving to the left and going downwards. Dragging the human up a steep slope would have been a pain, even with its nigh inexhaustible body. It couldn't really feel anything beyond that, so it focused on what was around them, just in case. A bunch of haphazardly, chaotically placed pipes that were either just holes in the stone, or pipes of iron that snaked through the stone, none of them leading to any kind of open air, and more often than not, having more than a couple of things walking around within them. As fun as a fight was, the wolf wasn't exactly looking for one, so it was going to avoid anything alive for as long as possible. The pipe they were in was relatively safe, at least, so it was going to drag the human and itself a bit further along and then stop to rest again just before the bend. It didn't really want to explore the unknown with half-healed injuries and with half its minor improvements not having kicked in yet. As it hooked its canines onto the front of the human's collar and started dragging her up, it was mildly surprised at how helpful and aware the human seemed, using her left arm to assist the wolf and barely making any sounds. She even gave the wolf one of her buffs to speed them along, which made the awkward backwards shuffle a little less tedious. Maybe she wouldn't be as much of a liability as it thought.